Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto Emperor Star Wars. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Faster, he had to move faster. The man was chasing him. The villagers were always nasty, they never liked him, though he didn't know why. But normally, the village's ninja generally treated him neutrally or just ignored him. Well, except for Gigi and some of the Anbu, but they were in the minority. Naruto couldn't believe he had screwed up like this though. He knew the man was drunk, he knew it, but he had been so hungry. He loved Ichiraku's, he considered the two who owned the shop to be some of his most precious people, but ramen alone wasn't enough to live on. And the man had just left nearly his entire meal in the trash. Of course, when the ninja had picked him up, he thought the worst that would happen was that he would be hit, but the man threw him out into the middle of the street instead. And there were just enough villagers who were just drunk enough and just bored enough to hold a round of fox hunting. And they did, chasing him for a while, some throwing garbage or rocks. Nothing too serious though, just a few bruises, a busted nose, just enough blood to sat most of them. Yet the ninja had not been satisfied with just a bit of blood. The drunken shinobi ran the kid out of the village proper, towards the training grounds. No one would be there with the festival going on. "You killed my wife, you demon. Please, I haven't hurt anyone," he whimpered. "Just go away, just please let me run far enough." A forest. Maybe if he could get into the forest he could hide. The man was a ninja, but he was also drunk, and Naruto knew he was small. "Fuck you, you monster." Naruto gasped as he felt something hit him in the arm. A kunai. The man was going to kill him, he had to get away. After what felt like hours of running, he realized he couldn't hear the shinobi anymore. Naruto stood still and listened, waiting for the crack of a twig, a rustle of a bush, anything that would let him know he wasn't alone. Nothing, except the occasional bird and the insects all around him. However, he now realized he had no idea of where he was. He knew he was still in the village, that much was sure, but all he remembered was that the shinobi had chased in the general direction of the training grounds. Sitting there, he let his mind drift back over his whole life. No one had ever tried to kill him before. On the worst days, always around if not on his birthday, he'd have rocks and garbage thrown at him. Usually the shinobi would either glare at him or smirk when he was hit with something. Whenever it got too bad, Anbu would always force the violent civilians away, so it wasn't like he ever to deal with mobs. Hell, the worst thing that had happened was a year ago, when he left the hellhole everyone else called an orphanage. Had been when a 10-year-old boy had gathered a bunch of his friends, convinced them to start a fox hunt, and chased him for an hour or so before they got bored. He hadn't been hurt too badly and they had been great training for dodging projectiles, so he really didn't mind too much. What was worse was when the drunks who had been encouraging them up to that point had been too far into their cups and decided to join in the fun. Naruto thanked every kami that was that the drunks had terrible aim. He was scared then and he was scared now. Fighting back tears, he hadn't wept since he was 3 and he wasn't going to now. He held his knees to his chest and took deep breaths until he was feeling better. It wasn't like he hadn't helped a few people after all. The Ichirakus were really nice to him and he made sure none of the drunks ever got too fresh with a yame. He was the demon child, he was far from deaf, and more than capable of spilling boiling hot broth on someone's lap and making it seem like an accident. He even let himself smile as he thought about the blind girl he saved from taking a beating. Naruto had never liked it when people who were innocent were hurt. It frustrated him. He always felt like he should defend those kinds of people because he knew he was strong enough to handle it. Now he knew he was just fooling himself. Because he couldn't even wait until a drunk shinobi had left to grab some food, he had taken a kunai to the shoulder and been chased into a training ground. Even Gigi would have been annoyed with him for making such a rookie mistake. It was at that moment he heard a loud growl. Slowly, very, very slowly, he turned around. Looking behind him, maybe 10 meters away, was a pair of very big, very bright yellow eyes. It must have smelt the blood from his arm. He had to do something. Naruto grit his teeth, grabbed onto the kunai in his arm, and pulled. After a moment of intense pain, and a yelp, the knife was free and the animal was attacking. Just before the animal pounced, Naruto brought the knife up and grabbed it with both arms, sending a jolt of pain through his injured arm, but he planted himself in a wide stance and marshaled what strength an exhausted, injured, malnourished 6-year-old could. When the creature hit him, he fell with the animal on top of him, and they rolled. Somehow, he had been standing just before a drop-off of some kind, and as they tumbled towards the ground, Naruto's last thought was that maybe his next life would be easier. Naruto groaned, his whole body ached. And with that thought he shot up, scrambling backwards until he hit the bark of a tree. Desperately looking around, panicking that the monster might get him. It had been a rabbit. Yes, the rabbit was the same size he was, but it was a freaking rabbit. He wanted to be Hokage and a freaking rodent had taken him down. Looking around, he also realized he had absolutely no idea where he was. More so than last night even. He remembered he was in the training grounds, so he shouldn't be too far away from the village, but which way to go? Deciding that he'd never get anywhere standing around, and somewhat hoping that he might be able to find something to eat, he simply started walking, following a small game trail. After perhaps 4 hours of walking, he came across a small creek. Realizing he hadn't had anything to drink since the day before, he happily drank his fill. However, he had to keep going, so he simply started walking again. Another 2 hours came and went before he arrived at a small clearing, spattered with what he recognized as dried blood. Calming down took a short while, but after his latest scare he started looking around, hoping to find something. What, he didn't know, but something useful, probably. Hopefully food, or a map, or kunai, or maybe even and that's when he came across it. A badly decomposed body, with only scraps of clothing and most of its smaller bones missing, and several very rusty kunai sticking out of what used to be its chest. After his third scare, which he calmed down from even faster than the other two, he figured that he ought to at least search the body. Walking up to it and removing the kunai, rusted to uselessness, but somewhat comforting in their weight, he found only one other thing. A small packet of documents. Sitting down on a fallen log, a good ways from the body, he opened up the packet. Have you seen that cat? Boring, the cat was caught the other day. This one is boring too. Man, all of these seem to be about some cat. Doesn't seem like something worth dying over, but this is a map. Finding a small fold-out map and opening it, his eyes were immediately drawn to the red X drawn in a far-off corner. Wait, maybe the cat wasn't a cat. Maybe it was a code word for treasure. The boy whispered. Codes, secrets, a map with a red X. It could only mean a secret treasure. Living on the streets taught him the value of money, and a treasure would definitely let him get more to eat. Maybe the Hokage would even make him a ninja if the treasure was important enough. Looking up at the sky, the sun was going down, so that was west, and the map had the symbol for a mountain near the X. And the X was in the top right corner, meaning it was in the northeast of the forest. Deciding to put the sun to his back and start walking, perhaps not his best idea considering his complete lack of supplies or equipment. Excluding a few rusty kunai, Naruto was determined to find this treasure and make the Hokage acknowledge him as a ninja. 3 days later, Naruto groaned. He had been in this forest for 4 days now and he had no idea where he was. He knew he had to reach the northeastern corner, find some low mountains or hills, then get to the eastern base of the mountains. That was where the treasure was. But it was turning out to be much harder than he thought it would be. Right now, all he could see were the hills in the distance, but they still looked so far away. Luckily he already knew the Kawarimi no Jutsu, substitution technique, and the Henge no Jutsu, transformation technique. Otherwise he doubted he could have scared off those wolves or escaped those giant leeches. Though he regretted that he just couldn't get that stupid clone down, it could have been so useful against that massive snake. However, he was rather happy as he had found no less than 3 dead ninja. After the first body, the corpses weren't so scary. He had even found some old rations, a tanto, and even some basic chakra training scrolls. The first, and best, of the scrolls talked about the 5 basic elemental exercises. The second had explained how to tree walk and water walk, and the third had explained the basic leaf, pebble, and sand exercises. He was going to have so much training to do when he got back. Unfortunately, that was when he heard a loud roar behind him. In a panic he pushed chakra out of his feet, hopefully allowing him to jump away from whatever was coming for him now. What happened was him pushing far too much chakra out of his left foot, throwing his leg up into the air, channeling his energy into the ground, and slamming him into said ground. Rather thoroughly winding him. Panting, seeing spots, he had no chance of dodging the massive paw that crashed into him. Fading from consciousness, he saw what he now confirmed was a truly terrifying giant bear, rearing on its hind legs and smashing into the ground where his body just was. Feeling the ground beneath him shifting, Naruto tried to stand up, only for the bear to begin charging him. "Damn, damn, damn, what am I going to do?" shouted the boy, reaching for his scavenged tanto. Too out of it to dodge, he braced himself, once again prepared to die. And I was so close to finding that treasure, so close to making Gigi acknowledge me. Naruto, with tears welling in his eyes, stood ready to receive the charging animal, betting on a single swipe, with all his strength, ready to fight to the bitter end. Then, a rattling filled the air, the sound of the Shinigami's chains, the sound of death. The bear stumbled, but began to only charge faster, and just as the animal reached him, Naruto slashed downwards with all his might. The strike was too early, missing the animal by several centimeters, but what surprised the boy were the massive chains impaling the animal. Blue chains, ending in what looked like a spear point, pierced the animal from 9 different directions, skewering the animal, and pinning it to the ground. Which he now noticed was spider-webbed with large cracks. And just as he noticed his chakra decreasing, in a panic shutting off its flow, the ground opened wide, swallowing him and the bear whole. While falling, he was struck with debris and bits of earth multiple times, finally hitting the ground with great force, just in time for the bear's corpse to land on most of his body, breaking many, many bones. Blessedly, he blacked out, his last thought being, "At least the damn bear didn't get me." Deep below the earth, machines dormant for many, many, many years stirred. 3 thoughts going through their synthetic minds: a breach in the tunnels, then it was, respond to security threat, and finally, awaken the master. While a squad of security droids escorted a trio of construction machines to repair the damaged tunnel, the base's medical machines began injecting cocktails into their one patient. As he stirred and twitched in his kolto tank, the construction droids had just finished moving the rubble. Noticing a single boy underneath the corpse of one of this world's predators, the machines readied their rifles. Only for a single command to reach them. Revan, for the first time in a very long time, felt the force. And it was screaming at him to stop these machines. He stirred, through the haze of the drugs and the intense, biting pain, struggling to grab onto the force. It felt so far away, like a whisper, instead of a roar. What was wrong with him, he wondered. He would figure that out later, the machines must be stopped. Reaching out with the force, he found the base's command systems, somehow sensitive to that energy. And while he doubted the machine could use the force, he could impart his orders. With the one thing he could tell them being, "Do not kill the child." How he could tell that was what he should say, he didn't know. All he knew was that was what he must say. And so he slipped back into the world of dreams as the pain and the drugs and his exertion became too much for him. The machines hesitated. Their master ordered them not to kill the child, easy enough. But it was dying, should they save it? Yes, the master would not have intervened if he didn't want it for later. So dispatching most of the medical droids, they prepared to gather the child. Moving rubble and animal aside, they surveyed the damage. Severe, should be fatal, yet it is already healing, how? And subroutines not used for 6 millennia activated and the machines picked up the child, well, most of it. Bringing it to a secondary medical facility, they began preparing the boy for the first of many surgeries. Injections of Bacta to stabilize him, anesthesia to ensure it does not awake, remove the clothes and its artifacts, secure them in a patient locker, and finally begin the surgery. And so they did. They worked on his body. Amazingly, the child responded much faster than they expected. Cuts had to be redone, incisions deepened, bones rebroken, but still, they worked. Eventually they placed it into a modified kolto tank, one with many devices, gauges, and needles that were not present in the usual tanks. As they read its data, more subroutines activated. It was at least partially human, but its DNA was far more efficient. Most, maybe all, of the junk DNA or duplicates removed. The whole strand simplified. Things they had never seen before were there, but still, they worked. His DNA could handle it. He, for it was now a he, could survive the process. His healing factor guaranteed it. So they began their mistress's most ambitious project, the one thing she never completed. Revan felt the pain recede some, not much, but just enough for him to wake. His whole body felt as if he had been set on fire. He ached, but he could push it off to the side. He turned what little force energy he could to healing himself and slipped back into the darkness. Again, he awoke, and again he returned after healing himself again and again. However, as time passed he could feel something in the force. It was dark and it grew every time he awoke. Eventually, its power began to remind him of his own. As time went on he felt it, like a wound in the force itself, bleed the dark side around it. He himself had once been that dark, yet he had turned back to the light, defeated his fallen apprentice, and saved the Jedi. But in the end he saw the Jedi falter. Not like he had, for his memories as Darth Revan were his once more. No, they had grown complacent, stagnant, and corrupt. He turned from them once again, going to confront the Emperor of the true Sith Empire by himself, but he remembered nothing past that. A loud beep interrupted his musing. "Ah, Master, it is good to see you awake. I had feared my medical programming had failed," came a rather happy tone. With that, his tank began to bubble, his whole body shook and the tank slowly emptied. Medical droids came out, carrying a robe and a towel. After drying his body, they covered him. "Machine, what is your designation?" "My designation is the Autonomous Research and Medical Rehabilitation Facility, or ARMR for short." "Where are we located?" "We are currently on the far western edge of the uncharted territories. This planet's designation is POO-1879, as it was the 1879th planet to have an outpost or colony on it." "And who developed these outposts or colonies?" "My mistress was, as I fear her dead, Darth Treya, or Mistress Surik as you knew her." "Surik? My general? Wait, when did she become a Sith?" "She was one of the few, and with that word, he remembered. The Jedi had stripped her power from her, exiled her. That one of the few people he had trusted had been treated so poorly had angered him. Therefore, when Jedi began to disappear, he ignored it, going to face his true foe, not this new one. Of course, he saw them, in the shadows. He felt them, though others did not. For some reason he also knew they were not his to defeat. And he let the Jedi face this new threat, hoping it would force them to grow or at least drive them to change. "Master, after your second attempt on the Emperor, Jedi began to disappear en masse. Hoping to discern what was killing them, they met upon the homeworld of the Miraluka. Their Darth Nihilus destroyed them all." "How?" "He devoured them. A variant of the death field technique, but on such a scale. Does he yet live?" "No, Mistress Treya slew him, Darth Sion, and the original Darth Treya, during a series of battles determining the fate of the galaxy approximately 10 years after your disappearance. So those were the ones hunting the Jedi. Huh, glad that she regained her powers then. Now, my last question for the moment is, what in the hell am I sensing?" "Clarify." "I sense, with greatly diminished powers I might add, a huge source of dark side force energy about 2 kilometers from here." "Ah, yes, that is the child you saved. To answer your second question, he was used in an experiment to revive the Sith species. I am rather proud to say that it was far more successful than even Mistress expected. Take me to him. Please follow the security droids." With that, a door opened and a pair of droids carrying blaster rifles stepped into the room. Revan walked towards them as they turned around and followed them into an open hallway. Like the room he had awoken in, the walls were painted white with various colored lines on them. He assumed they led to major areas, the mess, barracks, the medical center, and so on. After 30 minutes or so of walking, he had arrived at a room with a reinforced security door, no lines leading to it, and as he walked toward it, he physically felt the locks disengaging. As he walked through a decontamination chamber he felt the child's power. He, the child, was as powerful as he was at his height, and likely completely untrained, considering how wild the power felt. Revan pondered his choices, deciding to search the boy's mind first, as it would be better to avoid awakening a monster. Once he stood in front of the single shielded Kolto tank in use, he extended his senses, following the trail of the Force, only to find a barrier of some kind blocking him. Searching the barrier, he found 36 points where it seemed particularly strong, but there were weak spots, and Revan was a very talented, what was he anymore? Jedi, Sith, exile, traitor, no, he was none of them. That was the truth, he was neither. Both had their flaws, but he felt far more sympathy for the path of the Sith. Not the wild impulsive destruction, but acting. The Jedi way always led to apathy. However, this was a thought for another time. He felt flaws in this field and he slipped inside, only to find himself in what seemed to be a truly ancient Sith tomb. He saw a series of runes carved along the walls, several red, but most were blue or black. He also felt two presences. Walking, he found himself in the heart of the tomb, faceless Sith statues looking down upon a raised dais, upon which a sarcophagus rested, the boy most likely, but as he walked, he felt a void. A place where there was simply no force energy, and he felt it was beneath the dais. And as he looked, he felt truly incredible malice, and finally a massive power. One that dwarfed him. It wasn't the force, rather it was a dead zone in the force, almost enough to push him out, and he could tell it was sleeping. Looking at the strange symbols covering the dais, he realized that he, with his knowledge of more than 700 languages, had never seen them before. They reminded him vaguely of Sith runes, perhaps some of their magic? But he had never before seen these exact symbols. Maybe the answers lay with the boy, perhaps, but still he should be careful. And so he approached the tomb, reaching out with the force as he did so. As he touched the boy's mind, he used extreme care as he slipped through his thoughts, mostly of pain, into his memories. In doing so, he felt anger burning in his gut for the first time since the genocide of the Cathar. He had taken great care to control his emotions over the years, but living this child's neglect and abuse pained him. The extreme isolation, the attacks, having stones or garbage thrown at him, mostly on his birthdays, the beatings, mostly from drunk civilians, occasionally drunk ninja. Never where the masked men could see it, it was enough to truly anger the ancient warrior. Already noticing a pattern, Revan realized the abuse always peaked on October 10th, never in the presence of the masked men or Gigi, the leader of these people. The boy's birthday, the date of a festival, and the date of an attack on their village 6 years ago. Moreover, the boy was 6. So an orphan of the attack? But what attacked? A powerful creature, the Kyuubi. Maybe, probably, the creature inside of him was what attacked the village. That would explain their hatred of him. Still, another emotion he thought long buried, sympathy. This child, so young, and an attempt on his life, the torture, yes it was torture, he had endured, and so much innocence. Yet one thing overshadowed his innocence, his potential. Ignoring his strength in the force, this strange energy, chakra, he called it, and a kekai genkei of some kind showed a great deal of promise. The boy's relationship and protection by the leader of the village showed a stronger than normal association, an important one to the boy. His name, Naruto, meaning he was the son of someone very important. But why neglect him? Politics probably, but he needed confirmation. However, whatever he decided to do, he could benefit from training the boy, and he did feel bad for him. Perhaps it was time for him to take another apprentice. Hopefully it would turn out better for him this time around. Revan chuckled. He doubted the boy would turn on him, considering the abuse he had suffered. Rather, Naruto would cling to him like a drowning man to a life raft. Yes, he would be able to trust the boy, rely on him, and most importantly, the boy would be very, very powerful. Maybe one day he would even surpass Revan himself. Awaken. With that, Naruto stirred, his body healed, covered in terrible scars, yet nothing that restricted his movement. He felt more than he ever had before. For some reason he was so heavy. He now realized that he was in a tank filled with something a bit thicker than water, and a strange device on his mouth let him breathe. Without panicking, he looked about, seeing nothing but pitch darkness. He felt fear well up within him. Just before he began thrashing, he felt the fluid began to drain and a bright light strike his eyes. Shutting them tight, he fell to the bottom of the now exposed medical tube. Just as the last of the fluid had slipped through the bottom, a loud hiss filled his ears. Feeling himself fall, he threw his arms out before himself, and they responded far too quickly. And his arms were red. He seemed to almost be falling in slow motion, and striking the floor, his body felt so light. It was too light. His body now felt like he only weighed 5, maybe 10 kilos. Looking up, he noticed a strange man standing before him, waist-length black hair, gray eyes, no shoes, and black, unadorned robes. Naruto noticed he could see the individual stitching on the robes, small imperfections on the man's stern face. He could smell 20 different chemicals coming from him as well. They smelled like a hospital smelled, only much stronger, with far greater variations between them. And everything seemed so loud. A few monitors were beeping, the man's heart, his own heart. How could he hear their hearts? What was going on? Calm yourself, young one. uttered the man in perfect Japanese. I mean you no harm. Who are you? Stuttered Naruto in response. My name is Revan, what's yours? Uzumaki Naruto. That's a very nice name, Naruto. Now, please dry yourself off, and put on these robes, said the man as two medical droids handed him a towel and a set of gray robes. Naruto, blushing, accepted both, and after drying himself noticed that these robes, while simple, were very well made, and even had slits for his additions to fit through. Excuse me Revan-san. Just Revan, the honorific, bothers me. Okay then, Revan, why was I in that tank? Why do I feel strange? What is this place? Where is this place, and what do you plan on doing with me? Slow down, chuckled Revan. First, you were injured terribly. A bear struck you and part of a tunnel collapsed on you. Secondly, you feel strange because to save you, the machines in this place changed you. Look at your reflection. Looking at the now closed tube he had been in, he saw his reflection in the glass and gasped. His skin was red, his eyes were yellow, his teeth were sharp, he had strange formations where his eyebrows used to be, his hair was black, his fingernails were claws and black as well. He had spikes coming from his elbows, and he only had 2 toes, with another spike coming from his heel. What had they done to him? What was he? He was a monster now, just like the villagers always said. Naruto began to grow angry, incredibly so. He would show those bastards what a real monster was. As he thought this, his power spiked, damaging the 2 nearby security droids. Calm yourself, ordered Revan, and somehow Naruto began to calm down. Calm Naruto, you are not a monster. However, you are only half human now. Half of you is now Sith in origin. A combination of Masashi and Kisai Sith, I believe. I heard your voice in the tank, you told me to wake up. Yes, I did, and I'm very glad you woke up. I was worried you might decide to sleep forever. Now, your third question, as to what this place is. It is a research and medical facility, designed initially to heal me, though you seem to have joined me as a patient of this place. Why did you do this to me? I did nothing. These machines were the ones who changed you. ARMR, what was the exact reason you changed him? Ah, Master, he had a healing factor. All other subjects failed to survive the change. We decided that as he would be crippled for life if he did not undergo the change, he would be happier with the experiment than without. I understand. So what happens now, Revan? Well, Naruto, that depends on you. You have a great deal of potential as a student of the Force. Considering your new form, you'll need to be able to defend yourself from those that would harm you. It would be very beneficial to learn the combat skills I can offer. And if you so desire, I will take you on as a full apprentice. What's the Force? Surely you feel it around you? All things, living or otherwise, have some presence in the Force. Even the machines you damaged and the medical droids would have some spark. You are far too powerful not to feel them, much less myself, even damaged as I am. I feel like I have a fire in my belly, but it's cold. So cold it almost hurts. Maybe, it's like a whisper, but from so far away. I'm sorry. Do not apologize. It's likely your other energy, chakra I believe it was called, is suppressing your Force abilities. Chakra seems to form a kind of barrier to the Force, though it is not enough to completely cut you off, powerful as you are, from my sensory abilities, as it is not a perfect barrier. Though I imagine with training it could do so. So you could train me in this Force? Maybe. Are you a shinobi then? No, I am not. However, many of my skills and techniques would be useful to a shinobi. Why do you ask? I wanted to become a shinobi, to make to the people of my village acknowledge me. They call me monster, demon, most of them ignore me, if I'm lucky. I just didn't want to be alone. Perhaps you still could become a shinobi. I'll train you to the best of my ability and help you to grow as a shinobi as much as possible. I may not know the techniques of a shinobi, but I know how to train assassins and infiltrators very well. So, do you accept my help? Yes, Revan. Good. Now, that I am your teacher, you are to refer to me as Master. I will explain why to you once we begin your training. For now, rest. ARMR, show him the way to a room, provide him with whatever he needs. Acknowledged Master, please follow the green line Naruto. Yes, Master. 30 minutes later. Revan was confused, he had thought the boy was mainly human, but these recordings were insane. His healing factor was ridiculous, not to mention the truly terrifying genetic manipulation. His pre-changed DNA could only be described as improved above and beyond the most advanced gene therapy. No redundancies, no junk DNA, the propensity for a huge number of common human ailments removed. And the unknown strands, they might account for the seemingly impossible feats in the boy's memories. Revan had seen and done more than almost any other Sith or Jedi he had ever heard of, yet much of what the boy remembered, not thought or imagined, but remembered just seemed impossible. But that would have to be investigated later, after he healed, or at least when the boy was trained. ARMR, explain the breakdown of his genetic code one more time. Certainly, Master. Pre-change, his DNA contained approximately 60.432% of the strands normally found in baseline humans. However, the supermajority, approximately 99.221%, of the missing strands were duplicates, genetic dead ends, or carried junk code. The remaining alterations are almost entirely new strands. Many of them can be traced back to baseline human traits, mostly affecting the pigmentation of various body parts, yet the rest seem to express themselves in a variety of different ways, including the production of an entirely different set of organs parallel to the nervous system. Interestingly enough, there appears to be no less than 4 strands of dormant genetic information and a strand that seems to have only recently activated. Curious, perhaps it was the ability he used to kill the bear. He vaguely knew something about Kekkei Genkai, or bloodline limits. Naruto seems to have been almost completely neglected and his education is abysmal. I will have to rectify that as quickly as possible. I wonder, ARMR, is it possible to activate the dormant strands? Yes, Master, I altered as little unknown DNA as possible, integrating the Sith strands rather than overriding his DNA. Explain the totality of the changes to me. I may not be an expert on xenobiology, but I've never seen a pureblood look like that. Not to mention he felt far too powerful, especially behind a barrier like the one his chakra created. Mistress Surik was not interested in simply recreating the Sith species, but rather perfecting the evolution of such a powerfully force-sensitive species. She was hunted by both the Sith Empire and the Trade Republic. Her students hunted her as well as the ones who brainwashed you. It was her understanding that she needed soldiers capable of winning a very bloody, very long war. Understood, but what were the exact changes she made and why did she fail? Mistress Surik mixed Masashi and Kisai Sith DNA to exploit the enhanced physical attributes of the warrior caste and the natural force talents of the priest caste. So his senses, all 5 of them, are increased to roughly 7 times that of baseline humans. Though I do believe he already possessed improved senses, but what extent is unknown, his final levels will likely fall within a predictable range. Additionally, his brain processes data much faster. With 3 times as many neurons and a theoretically infinite supply of stem cells, he will in essence see and hear faster than baseline humans. This includes the obviously enhanced reflexes as well as superior information processing and retention. His physical enhancements include natural clotting and pain suppression agents, changes to his ear structure, eyes, and tongue. His muscles are now significantly denser, while the composition of his skin and bones has been changed to support his now drastically improved strength. While he would not be able to throw tanks about, he could easily shift one, while his bones would allow him to survive falls at terminal velocity along with a fused and completely upgraded rib cage. To compensate for the damage this could cause to the lungs through constriction, great improvements are made to the lungs themselves while the total volume of the rib cage was expanded. His skin will not stop a determined attacker, but it will offer some resistance to non-vibro-bladed weaponry. Blasters will still burn through, though their effects will be reduced. His internal organs are also improved, though the augmentations are purely biological. To clarify, he no longer possesses an appendix, he has gained barriers between major organs that will prevent blood loss or infection, significant improvements in the function of all of his organs, and has gained 2 organs. The first is a self-replenishing repository of stem cells while the second is a dual-function lung allowing him to breathe underwater. Finally, all known genetic defects or propensities for disease have been removed. He is essentially the perfect specimen. So basically he heals faster, thinks faster, runs faster, hits harder, sees in the dark, can't lose his balance, breathes underwater, smells, hears, and sees better, while healing any injury given sufficient time along with a general resistance to poisons and toxins. Damn, Surik doesn't do things by half measures. Question, are his claws and teeth functional weapons? Of course, master. Again, damn, and all of this is genetic, meaning his kids would have all of these traits as well. And considering that Sith reach adulthood in 14 years or so, Surik would have had a population of super soldiers breeding at twice the rate of the Jedi or the Sith. ARMR. Why was Naruto chosen to undergo these improvements? Mistress Surik failed to complete the experiments before her death. The reason the experiments failed was that none of the subjects survived the transformation, all dying before the process could finish. Naruto possessed a powerful healing factor, and it was decided that he would be the most likely candidate to survive the process. Well, I can't wait to see where he'll go. Anyways, go over the base's supplies and what Surik left behind for me. Of course, master. 15 minutes later, Naruto sighed as he looked into his reflection, thinking back on his day. The first thing he could remember was Revan, his new master, apparently, somehow speaking in his head. Then the tank. Naruto shuddered, remembering the pitch black and how it seemed like his senses had been completely cut off. And of course the searing pain in his stomach, now more of a dull ache, scared him as well. Of course the machines had scared him too, but he guessed they were just puppets or something like that. Learning that he could now use something called the Force was cool though. He could feel it, just at the edge of his perceptions. It felt cold, but somehow like an embrace. It confused him. But what confused and scared him the most was what he looked like. His face was mostly the same, the shape was sharper though. He still had his whiskers on his cheeks, darker in color and much more pronounced than they used to be. He wondered why they itched for some reason. The most striking changes was his now much thicker black hair and the deep red coloration of his skin. They were probably the only changes that actually bothered him, considering his now black and much sharper nails wouldn't be particularly obvious, and sharp teeth, though perhaps not as sharp as his weren't uncommon among some of the more unusual shinobi. However, the changes to his feet bothered him a bit, especially the spikes on the back of his feet, though he guessed they would be pretty useful in taijutsu. Frowning as he tested the spikes on the back of his elbows, he figured they were pretty tough, but using them for anything but specifically trained attacks would be difficult, and he would have to be careful not to knock anything over with them. Since his spikes were black, just like his nails, most people would probably take them to be weapons of some kind, so that would be okay too. Sighing once again, he realized he was far more tired than he had first thought. He turned to the small cot in the room he had been led to and slipped underneath the thin sheets, still clothed. Sleep did not come quickly, but it did come. And the final thought Naruto held that night: perhaps this won't be so bad. 51 BBY Month 4. Naruto groaned, his whole body aching. His master had kept his word. The training was brutal and thorough. The worst thing was that Revan claimed that these were just warm-up exercises and they pushed Naruto to his limits. Though his new physical powers were nice, and still growing at that, the 16-hour days of training, only stopping for meals and bathroom breaks, were intense. Combine that with the fact that Revan spent half of the remaining time inside his head teaching him, well, everything. He had apparently scoured Naruto's memory, recreating Japanese, and then ensured that Naruto himself mastered all that Revan could figure out. Of course, that would be incredibly impressive were it not for the fact that he sped time up by an order of magnitude inside Naruto's mindscape. Revan claimed that he had precious little time to teach him things that took the man half a century to master. If Naruto was being perfectly honest with himself, he loved listening to Revan. The man answered every question he asked so long as he knew the answer, only asking Naruto to avoid a few personal subjects. And Revan had started teaching him everything. Well, he was definitely stronger and smarter. Calmer too, unless he got angry, that was. Blushing a bit, Naruto recalled as his master explained the nature of the power within him, explaining that it fed on his emotions after he had ripped apart a training target with his bare hands. Revan had decided that Naruto's final training schedule, once he was up to par, would be 4 hours of physical training, 4 hours of meditation, 4 hours of chakra control exercises, 4 hours of various skill training. Revan had explicitly stated that it was incredibly dangerous to specialize solely in combat and ignore his more practical skills. 4 hours of teaching inside of his mind, and 4 hours of free time. which Naruto had quite happily used for sleeping, even if his body didn't need as much rest as it used to, and he regained his physical energy while learning. And ARMR was really cool too. Though he could be a bit blunt, like when he had mentioned that Naruto was in that damn tube for 6 months. He was really helpful whenever Naruto had needed anything though. To be honest, other than missing the Hokage and Ichirakus, everything in his life was better. Even his living conditions were better than before he had come here. After that first night, ARMR had directed him to a new room. It was a bit depressing at first, what with everything being gray or black, but once Naruto had been able to add a few touches of orange, he appreciated the dark and the quiet of the room almost as much as he appreciated his attached shower facilities. Naruto had spent many hours under the pure bliss that was the hot water of his beloved shower. Frankly, the 2 bookshelves, desk, moderately sized bed, couch, media center containing what both Revan and ARMR had called music. Naruto shuddered at most of Revan's taste. A synthesizer and beat machine did not create music, though some of the arias were nice, gave the rather large room a spacious if empty feel. Naruto wasn't complaining though, it was a very nice place, especially compared to his old apartment. Even the food wasn't that bad. Nothing quite on the level of Tucci and Ayame of course, but quite a bit got close. He was happy, even if his training sometimes felt like Revan was just a sadist. 51 BBY Month 6. Naruto centered himself. Revan had decided to have him spar against a combat droid for the first time and he was ready. He opened his eyes, Revan shouted, "Begin." Naruto immediately launched himself forward. Deciding to put his opponent on the defensive, Naruto began with a series of 3 quick slashes, his claws showing their power with the damage they caused to the machine. Following up with a sweep, the machine jumps over the attack. Naruto immediately spins himself around, leaning into a handstand, and kicking the machine with both feet. The droid, rebounding from the attack, lands 2 meters away, then launches itself forward. A flurry of blows came straight for Naruto's head. Naruto bats each one away just in time to notice a hammer fist coming straight for him. Twisting, he traps the arm before turning into the attack, sliding up into the droid, and then throwing the machine in one smooth motion. Planting himself, Naruto brings his heel up, ready for an axe kick. The machine blocks the attack, but his heel punches through the armor of the right arm. Using Naruto's trapped heel to its advantage, the robot pulls forward, bringing his other arm up to punch Naruto in the bend of the knee. Responding with a kick to the incoming arm, Naruto plants his left foot on the machine's head, just before ripping his embedded heel out with a back flip. Returning to a ready stance, Naruto prepares himself for the droid to resume its offensive. Jumping up, the machine begins to circle Naruto, looking for a flaw in the boy's defense. As soon as the machine launches itself at him, Naruto drops into a low stance, intercepting the machine's strike by impaling its good arm with the spike on his right arm. Yanking the machine off balance by pulling his arm forwards, Naruto turns into the falling machine, driving his left spike into the droid's eye socket, disabling the machine. As soon as it begins to drop, Naruto jumps away from the machine, sliding once more into his ready stance. "Good job, my boy, your performance was spectacular," exclaims Revan, as he walks towards his apprentice clapping. "I think it is time you began your sword training, do you not?" "I would very much appreciate this, master," murmurs the now 1.6-meter tall boy. "Do not worry, my student. You're moving far faster than any other I have seen. It would not be unusual for others to take anywhere from 2 to 4 years to reach this point. And the least among the students of the Force would not have even come this far." "I know, master. I'm just a bit anxious. And that's normal, considering you are mastering 2 separate powers. You have twice as much to do. That is why I train you as hard as I do. Considering that you have already mastered the first meditation exercises, I think I may change your schedule a bit. Perhaps 2 hours meditating, 2 hours with weapon practice? You do need to learn how to use a blaster after all." "Thank you, master, I would enjoy that very much." 51 BBY Month 12. Remember, Naruto, just survey the area around the tunnel exit, make sure the drone creates a local map, and then see if you can identify any permanent positions nearby. I know you said the breach occurred in a training ground, so we need to make sure it doesn't receive regular use. "Yes, my master," stated Naruto, kneeling before Revan. The boy had been educated in the way of the Sith, and he had chosen to show this deference to his teacher. He knew the man was truly great. Revan had shaken the galaxy no less than 3 times, he was also simply very, very powerful. While Naruto surpassed him in terms of raw might, he felt Revan's strength return a bit more every day, and the man's experience allowed him to outclass Naruto many times over, even in his weakened state. If asked, Naruto would deny he had anything but pride in his teacher. To himself, however, he admitted he felt unease flowing through the man. Sometimes Naruto could feel a darkness about the man, something that he knew was not his master, and it grew with his master's power. Sometimes the man seemed to even be lost amongst his thoughts. Even though it was plain that his master was in pain during those moments, he never mentioned it to Naruto. The fact that the man who had shown him so much was suffering worried Naruto. Though Armr believed that it was simply damage from the long stasis, Naruto knew it was something more. But he would worry about that later. For now, he had a mission to complete. Silently, Naruto reviewed his equipment. First, his pair of short swords, simple durasteel creations. They were 60 centimeters long and honed to a razor edge. Second, his armored robes, a medium-thickness hydrophobic, nano-weave, ankle-length gray robes equipped with an armored overlay that somewhat resembled his master's customized Starforge robes. That is an armored chest guard, with overlapping plates that resembled an Okagawa do without the battle skirt. Bracers that allowed full movement of the fingers while protecting his forearms and the back of his hands. Greaves that covered the top of his feet, shins, and the side of his thighs, and a simple gray assassin's mask with the Sith rune for silence over the mouth guard. All in gray, and all of it weighing no more than 20 kilograms. This rather plain outfit was completed with a rough spun gray wool cloak, to cover his elbow spikes and somewhat cover his strange feet. He wasn't taking additional weapons or supplies as it would weigh him down, and escape was far more preferable than combat. Considering who and what he was, he truly doubted he had any chance to make the villagers acknowledge him, and his master's secrecy was imperative. Killing ninja would send the entire village into lockdown and draw Sarutobi's personal attention. A spy escaping the Anbu would only have hunter teams sent out and the perimeter reinforced. The former he would be hard-pressed to survive, the later could simply be worked around. And now, he was ready. Taking a deep breath and placing his mask on his face, he left the armory. 30 minutes later, very quietly and very quickly, Naruto moved through the low brush surrounding the surface exit, a small hatch about a meter square, hunting for any possible signs of a shinobi's presence. The small probe he had deployed fed a constantly updating stream of information into his small HUD. While being very useful, couldn't give him an accurate view of the forest below its canopy. As such, a physical inspection was the only thing that would guarantee results. In order to minimize the chances of him being detected, they had launched the mission just after the sun had set, on the night of a new moon, and when there was a great deal of cloud cover. However, these measures seemed to have failed, as after only half an hour of mapping, Naruto had already sensed someone. Thankfully, they seemed to be in a clearing about 500 meters north of the entrance, but anyone this close to the base could be a threat, and Naruto moved to investigate. After only a minute or so of force-enhanced running, he had taken position in a small ditch, right on the edge of the clearing. Carefully, Naruto reached out with the force, while focusing it to sharpen his already superhuman hearing. These acts allowed him to both estimate their amount of chakra, and therefore their amount of power, and hear their discussion as if they were both speaking directly to him. And now that old bastard is getting suspicious, he's even sent me to teach those damn brats. Calm yourself, Mizuki. Orochimaru-sama is pleased with these scrolls, but you must acquire the scroll of seals. Take your time, he doesn't care how long it takes you. Just make sure you don't get caught. All right, Kabuto. We'll have to stop meeting like this. Damn Cage partnered me up with some joke of a Chunin. Iruka was his name, and he'll get suspicious if we meet up regularly. Understood. You know where the dead drop is, and I'll undoubtedly hear about the scroll being stolen, so you can guess what needs to be done. Now, we must go. Yeah, I'm going, and don't worry, it'll all be taken care of. Naruto remained absolutely still, suppressed his chakra as much as he physically could, and dared not even breathe as the two conspirators took off in opposite directions. After waiting a short while, he moved out, aiming to complete his objectives before the night was already over. In the end, it had only taken him 2 hours to sweep the area immediately around the entrance, and he had only picked up one other human scent. Strangely enough, that scent consisted of oil, snakes, and sweets. It was most definitely unusual, but not in an entirely unfamiliar way. Deciding it was time to return, Naruto recalled the probe, and made his way back to the facility's entrance, prepared to report his findings to his master. 45 minutes later, Revan was truly having difficulty believing his luck. His student had completed his first mission without difficulty, found that only a single shinobi entered the training ground with any regularity, uncovered a conspiracy to steal a vitally important artifact, and returned without encountering any hostiles. Revan was also a student of the Force, and as such he believed in neither coincidences nor luck. As was the case, he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Since it had not, this meant that the inevitable disaster waiting at the end of this streak of good fortune was going to be horrific. And it would be his job to protect his apprentice as much as possible. ARMR, I've come to a decision. Summon Naruto and prepare the experimental chamber. A single beat, the only acknowledgement of his order. Knowing that his student needed to grow, especially if the village had enough traitors that his apprentice could randomly meet too, on his first mission at that. Then he needed the boy ready for when this place was inevitably ripped apart. And the quickest way to do that would be to start awakening his bloodlines. Of course, the fact that he was carrying out medical procedures beyond the wildest dreams of the scientists of his lifetime was pure coincidence. Even if he had been a Jedi. With that, Revan heard his student walk into the room behind him, kneel, and utter a simple, "Master." Turning to the boy, he calmly analyzed his student. There were many things that could happen in the coming years. His student could die in battle, he could be betrayed, and illness could strike him. All of them unlikely, but all possible, and there were few things he could do in order to protect his student, aside from training the boy into the ground, that is. With a smile, Revan began explaining his decision. Naruto, this village is not safe, and we lack the capability to relocate to a more secure location. For that reason, I've decided to offer you the chance to awaken a few dormant Kekkei Genkai. Master, if they are dormant, how would I be able to access them? Wouldn't that mean I'm only a carrier for the recessive gene? Under normal circumstances you would be correct. However, Surik, the person who built this outpost, was a master geneticist by the time of her death. And this base contains the most advanced genetic manipulation technology I have ever seen or heard of. Not even the Rakuten came close. And ARMR is confident he can activate the bloodlines, though it will require a great deal of time. So I'll be in the tube and my training will be put on hold. How long will the process take? And what bloodline will I gain? ARMR believe it would take 6 months, and we aim to activate a bloodline that, not coincidentally, affects your blood. It should improve your rate of healing, grant your immune system a serious upgrade, and your blood would gain healing properties. And to answer any possible future questions, we wish to avoid possible complications between this world's biosphere and your alien biology, and the reason this bloodline was chosen is that it is the strongest one present in your body. Normally it would only be present in females, but we can quite easily convince it to awaken in your body, with only the most minor of hormonal changes. Master, so long as you believe this to be the correct path forward, I shall take it. Very well then, my student. Prepare yourself. And without another word, Naruto stripped, placed a medical suit over his body, stashed his equipment in a patient locker, and got into the modified Kolto tank. The last thing he remembered was ARMR telling him to put a mask over his mouth and relax. 50 BBY Month 8. A 2-meter-tall red-skinned humanoid stood in the middle of no less than 20 skeletal-looking machines. All of which currently held a repeating blaster rifle. And all of which were aiming at the being, who was protected by nothing more than 2 shining swords, a pair of loose black pants, and some bandage wrappings around his feet and hands. At an unseen signal, all of the machines opened fire. And each and every shot was immediately deflected into one of the other droids. The man had redirected no less than 200 shots within a second. However, the slaughter was not yet complete as a group of 5 much larger machines dropped from an entrance in the ceiling. Reacting as they fell, the humanoid threw his blades, impaling 2 of the 3 machines in front of him. As they were thrown towards the wall, he immediately launched himself towards the 3rd machine, striking it in the chest with 3 rapid jabs. Knocking the droid back and cracking its torso, he simply explodes forward in a burst of pure speed and staves the machine's chest in with a vicious kick. turning into a leg sweep as the final machines approach him. The droids jump, just as the man wanted. As the two machines reach the apex of their jump, he kicks one into the ceiling hard enough to damage the duracrete and blocks the downward kick of the final machine. Hearing his arm snap under the droid's blow, he turns into the strike, and using his good arm, hip tosses the machine onto the floor. After this, he promptly smashes his foot through his final opponent's head. Having cleared the room, he grabs his left arm, the broken one, and snaps it back into place just before his healing factor finishes fixing the damage. Turning to look at the destroyed chassis of one of his sparring partners, the 2-meter-tall, red-skinned humanoid looks over himself. Long black dreadlocks reach his waist, his yellow eyes dominate his angular, predatory face. He'd be called attractive if his features weren't so sharp and if he didn't have two prehensile-faced tendrils drooping down from right beside his nose. Sharpened, black teeth with extremely prominent canines and a longer-than-human normal tongue make up his mouth, while cartilaginous ridges have grown where his eyebrows should be. Blackened nails, each sharpened to a point, complement his Y-shaped feet, each composed of 2 toes, ending in similarly sharpened black nails, and a heel spike. His well-muscled torso and arms are relatively normal, save for the 2 spikes of bone jutting from his elbows and what appears to be a solid, if articulated, set of bone plates where on a human a normal ribcage would be. He was Uzumaki Naruto, remade in the image of the perfect Sith. And he was ready. For 6 months his body was changed, and for 5 years within his mind he was taught in the old way of the Sith. Most would call it torture, most would call it cruel, it would break almost anyone who underwent it. But he did not break. No, he thrived. He only screamed once. And after the first year his master began to teach him all the dark secrets he knew. Poisons and medicines, languages and the way of making war with nothing but words, how to torture and cause pain without damage to a body, and so much about the history of his people. And the pain only focused him. Now he was ready to take his first life, to make his first kill, and his master had decided it was time for him to go out into the world and do so. Moving to the armory, ARMR and its machines would see to the training room. He toweled what little sweat he formed off himself. Having arrived after a short walk, he reviewed his equipment. 2 Mandalorian-style heavy blaster pistols, 20 throwing knives, 2 thermal detonators, his rations, his gray apprentice's robes, omniscope, datapad with the locations of his targets, and his twin Sith war swords. His own creations were not quite up to the standards of the ancients, but the fact that they would shatter durasteel blades with a single strike spoke volumes of both the blades and his own power. It helped that he could channel both force energy, his own Sith magic, and chakra through them as well. His master had taught him well indeed. As if summoned by the thought, and with his master that was possible, Revan walked into the room, ready to deliver the final instructions to his apprentice. Dropping to one knee and bowing his head in submission, Naruto uttered only 2 words, "My master." "Rise, my apprentice. It is time for you to earn your robes as a true Sith. You will make your first kill. To guide you in this I have set you 3 targets and they are to be neutralized in the following ways. 1 is to be slaughtered and silenced. None may escape or know of your presence. The 2nd is to be ambushed, yet engaged in a frontal attack, none may escape. At the 3rd and final camp you are to reveal yourself. Fear is a powerful weapon and to wield it, you must give them something to fear. Only one may survive this slaughter and you shall mark him." "Yes, my master." Clapping his student on the shoulder, Revan turned to Boy and began speaking in a far kinder tone. "Naruto, you have already made me proud. And I am truly sorry you have had to endure what you have endured, but you have come so far, so quickly. These next few days will be a challenge, but I know you shall make me even prouder." "Thank you, Sensei. I appreciate everything you have done for me. Even if it was not all pleasant, you have saved me from horrors I could not imagine." "Good my boy, good." And with that Revan turned and left his student to finish his preparations. 3 days later, Naruto dropped from the tree he had been hiding in. It was time for him to begin his attack. For the last 3 days he had dodged ninja patrols to escape through the main entrance of the village. Easy enough when the guards were asleep. Moved without being seen to the first bandit camp he was to destroy, and scouted the camp out for 2 days. He had identified no less than 7 points of entry a non-shinobi warrior could use, twice that for a shinobi, and only a bit less than 100 different plans of attack he could use. all without violating his orders. After a short climb through the branches of the trees surrounding the clearing, Naruto waited for one of the men to break from the perimeter. After an hour or so, a pair of guards walked over from their initial position with only one going into the forest itself. Quickly moving into position to eliminate his first target, Naruto waited until the man began to drop his trousers. At the moment his target grabbed his belt, he struck, dropping onto the target's back, placing the man in a chokehold, and kicking the back of the target's knees in less than a second. After squeezing as hard as he could, Naruto realized he had destroyed the man's throat, to the point his entire neck was deformed. Looking down at his first kill, a younger man than he expected, perhaps only 16 or so. The poor boy's face showed pure horror as death embraced him. Mouth open in a silent scream, tears forming in his eyes from the pain of having his neck crushed, said destroyed neck with pulverized vertebrae showing, a small pool of blood forming. And he felt sight of your first kill was supposed to change you. You were supposed to freeze up, vomit, some even screamed. Shrugging, Naruto figured his training worked. Moving quickly, Naruto reached the edge of the forest and grabbed the second guard from behind. Snapping this man's neck, he moved across the space between the forest and the camp in a moment. Staying just out of the firelight, Naruto approached each tent in turn, slitting the back of those he sensed occupants in, slipping into each, and then killing the men silently. Once his rounds were complete, taking less than 10 minutes to kill 30 men, Naruto positioned himself a few meters away from the final 7 men sitting around the main campfire. Drawing 6 throwing knives and preparing his swords to be drawn, he struck. As soon as the knives left his hands he drew his 2 blades and launched himself at his final target. The 6 men were hit in their throats and the knives over-penetrated the bodies, knocking each back several meters in the process, while his swords impaled the final man through the throat and right lung. Withdrawing his blades, Naruto pulses his chakra, looking for any survivors, and detecting none moves to collect his knives. After cleaning his knives and swords and looting the camp of anything he could use, Naruto decided he was ready to move off, ready to wipe out the second camp and be one step closer to being done with this mission. 2 days later, surveying the target one last time, Naruto began his mental checklist: 52 bandits, no shinobi, only one likely to be able to use chakra, 12 have bows, 40 have spears and clubs, 1 has armor, that one was most likely the one that could use chakra. Obstacles were a light palisade with a barricade and weak gate. To fulfill the mission parameters I must wait until a patrol leaves and attack when the gate is open. After finishing his checklist, Naruto settled in for a wait. After about 2 hours a group of 10 bandits began to leave the camp and Naruto reacted. Launching himself from his hiding place in a ditch on the side of a trail leading to the camp, Naruto gathered a large amount of fire-natured chakra in his lungs. Once he was about 15 meters away he released all of the energy in a massive fireball, easily 5 meters wide, frying the men trying to leave the camp, the gates, most of the wall around the gates, and the first half of the bandits before dispersing. Launching himself through the collapsing gate, he dropped in front of the panicking bandits. Sighting their probable leader, coming out of the largest tent with half his armor on, Naruto burst forward and drove his heel spike through his target's head. Jumping up, removing his heel from his target, and charging a burst of lightning chakra, Naruto mapped the position of every remaining hostile in the camp. Once his spin had finished he unleashed a massive wave of lightning, hitting and frying every bandit in the camp. Dropping from his final technique, Naruto surveyed the damage. The destruction was limited to the inside of the wall, for the most part at least, with everything either reduced to dust or shattered to fragments by the final attack. Looking at the ground, Naruto realized most of the earth had been turned to glass. Deciding there was nothing to be gained, and that he maybe needed to reduce the power of his attacks, Naruto left. Ready to finish his final task, return to his master, and get a real shower, he began the journey to his final target. 2 days later, it was time. His final target, 60 men, 4 of them shinobi, none of them even close to his level. His mission: attack them, kill all but one, and mark the last of his targets. Terrify his enemies into submission. Wield fear as a weapon. And maybe even have a bit of fun. Smiling, though no one would be able to see it, Naruto moved into position. Right in front of the entrance to the camp. Removing his mask, Naruto adjusted the hood of his cloak, ensuring no one would see his face, and looked. After a few minutes one of the bandits walked up to him. "Oi, you, what you doin'? You bees be gettin' outta air if you don't wanna beatin' ya here? Hey Chikaru, what's goin' on out there? I don't know boss. Some fellas standin' in the middle of the road. You starin' at the ground. Well kill them and be done with it. All rig boss, if ya say so." As the bandit named Chikaru moved towards Naruto, the boy let his hood fall back. A shocked gasp was all that had time to escape the bandit's mouth as Naruto's hand shot forward, grabbed the man, and snapped his neck. As soon as the others heard the loud crack of the broken bone, they grabbed their spears and clubs and moved to attack Naruto. With a single flick of his wrist he disposed of the first of his targets, and after taking a second to savor the looks of fear on the faces of his enemies, his mind turned inward. To the pain in his gut, the pain he knew to be some entity of chakra. And he pulled it up with all his might. Red chakra exploded from his body as whisker marks carved themselves into his cheeks anew, now pitch black, almost as if they were tattoos. After but a moment the chakra settled itself into the rough shape of his body and a single tail formed. And with this new power Naruto launched himself forward, literally ripping the bandits apart. As the limbs flew Naruto once again disappeared in flash, coming to rest in the center of the camp. Sending out a single pulse of chakra to identify his targets, Naruto called his chains into being. Formed of his now red chakra, they sought out every single man within that camp. Impaling each in turn, only a few made it past them, desperately trying to either escape or attack the boy. Naruto cared little, charging water-natured chakra as his hands, forming two massive whips from his energy. Lashing out with his new weapons he grabbed all those trying to escape, right before crushing them. With only 3 remaining, Naruto charged earth chakra in his right hand and wind in his left. Striking 2 of the bandits simultaneously, the first simply exploded, the other having his body ripped into shreds. With his mission all but complete, Naruto allowed the last bandit to reach him, and then grabbed the man's head. After only a moment of contact with his toxic chakra Naruto dropped him. Seeing that the man's face was burned and that he was blind, Naruto reined in his power, placed his mask back on his face, and walked off. Already preparing for his debriefing and ready to finally take a shower again. Launching himself at his master, Naruto opened with his favorite move. A devastating axe kick, his heel spike granting him an advantage almost no one would expect or have trained to counter. Waiting as his master reacted by parrying his kick to the side, Naruto used the momentum to his advantage, snapping another kick at his teacher. Who then reacted with a block, transitioned into a grab, and finally threw the boy clear across their training room. Rolling and then sinking his claws into the training room floor, Naruto relied on his claws to anchor his body weight while he gave the room a quick once-over, preparing for any hidden droids to ambush him. The 20 square meter, 5 meter tall gray room with Duracrete floor was almost completely bare. Only his claw marks and the small joints of the hidden panels in the ceiling marring an otherwise perfectly smooth room. Deciding that he wasn't about to be ambushed, Naruto launched himself forward again. Opening with a series of 3 rapid jabs, Naruto couldn't help but laugh at how quickly his master reacted to each blow. Anticipating his master's double palm thrust, he quickly shifted to the side, aiming a kick at his master's knee, only for Revan to block the kick and retaliate with one of his own. After hopping back, Naruto took a moment to reflect on how efficient his teacher's style was. The simple fact being that each of Naruto's strikes would kill a normal human outright, yet his teacher could take a dozen hits and strike back twice as hard. That his master was so effective against him only illustrated the power and experience Revan possessed. Preparing himself to open with another combo, Naruto scanned his teacher for opening or weaknesses. His 2-meter-tall master had his waist-length black hair tied behind him, while his chest-length beard twitched in amusement at his student's glare. On a normal person that hair would be a vulnerability. On his teacher it was an invitation to take one of his force-enhanced blows to the face for your trouble. The simple black robes his teacher wore, now somewhat torn, offered no vulnerabilities either. Any possible handholds being easily reached by his teacher's strikes far before Naruto could throw him. Figuring that his best bet would lie in being unpredictable, Naruto came in from his master's left side this time. Opening with a quick snap kick before lunging forward with a knife hand, Naruto let his master grab his extended wrist. and then promptly brought his teacher into a hip toss. As soon as his master entered the air, Revan twisted and brought his legs underneath his body and launched himself at Naruto's knees. Letting his master go to avoid having his knees snapped, Naruto readied himself once again, turning to face his teacher just in time to see the man land on his fingertips, launch himself 10 meters back, and slip back into an easy ready stance. Naruto mirrored his master, one hand at his waist, the other with palm facing out, both open and ready to snap into a fist or slide into a block at the slightest provocation, and with his knees bent and in a wide stance. This time his teacher came at him, launching a series of enhanced spear hands, jabbing into the parries and occasional blocks of his student, each strike rattling bones. At the end of the exchange, Naruto launched into a simple series of strikes, attacking in short patterns, trying to trap his master in a sequence, just to attack from an unexpected direction. After a few minutes of their blows shaking the room, Naruto slipped into a wide stance, throwing a reinforced elbow, spike ready to taste blood. His master only had one choice, and that was to block with a hand, leading to Naruto scoring first blood as he impaled his teacher's palm. Unfortunately for Naruto, his master did not take the blow well, quickly slamming his uninjured hand into Naruto's unprotected abdomen and launching the boy into the far wall, causing a portion of it to collapse onto his charge, not allowing the boy a chance to recover. His master moved to strike him. Naruto used his own master's favorite combo against him, a quick palm strike to the offending limb, and a retaliatory spear hand of his own. Feeling his fingertips cutting some of his master's beard, Naruto could only grunt when he felt his whole body take a hit in return. After climbing out of the now much deeper hole in the wall, he noticed that his master was chuckling. In a brief flash of white energy, the injury to his master's left hand disappeared. However, his master did not re-engage. Knowing what was about to come, Naruto was more than ready to receive the combat droids as they fell from the ceiling. 20 large machines dropped from holes in the ceiling, each landing in a small crouch before launching themselves forward. The first met its end at Naruto's claws, a double spear hand ripping through the machine's arms before impaling its torso. With a twist of his arms, Naruto sent the remains of his first target into 2 other combat droids, shredding them. Turning to confront a fourth enemy, he jumped, landed on the machine's head, grabbed it by its neck, and dropped down to the floor while snapping his target's spine on his shoulder. A quick slash of his claws guaranteed the kill. With only a fifth of his targets down, the rest had moved into position and surrounded him. Now engaged by 16 enemies, even if they were much weaker than him, he had been pushed to finally use his powers. Drawing upon the force, Naruto focused for a single moment, willing his enemy's destruction. At that moment, 16 bolts of red lightning leapt from his hands, striking the remaining machines in the chest. As soon as the tainted energy touched the droids, each had their internal components fried and large sections of their chassis disintegrated by the fell energy. Revan was astonished. His 8-year-old apprentice had not only beaten him in a spar, but had mastered his unique form of force lightning. As Revan's own techniques were usually purple or blue, he was quite surprised when his student began unleashing red bolts of all things. However, that paled in comparison to the damage those red bolts could do. If fully suppressed, his own lightning would only cause intense pain and mild electrical burns. His student's earliest attempts with the lightning had completely disintegrated his targets. And amusingly, it seems his apprentice had finally achieved a measure of control of his power. Smiling, Revan decided it was time to inform his student of his plans for the future, then begin preparing the holocrons for his apprentice's future use. Dropping from the now exposed catwalk over the training room floor, Revan began, "Naruto, I believe it is time to bring your training to a climax. You have mastered the basics of everything I had to teach you. In time I have no doubt you shall discover many, perhaps even all, of the higher mysteries of the Force. Unfortunately, your training in the natural powers of your homeworld has suffered. It is time to rectify that error." "Master, by this, you mean to send me after the Scroll of Seals?" "Of course, my apprentice, you didn't think all those months of watching Mizuki and Kabuto would go to waste, did you? It goes without saying that I would not send you on such boring and pointless missions every 2 weeks if there was not a purpose. Other than training your stealth skills, that is. If nothing else, you have impressed the need to master the more mundane arts and skills. Even when the Force does provide an answer, Master, And do you not remember the stories I told you of how one of my own students slipped on a pebble, lost his concentration, dropped his force cloak, and was then engaged and subsequently killed by Republic conscripts? I remember, Master. Good, because after your next mission, ARMR and I have decided to unlock your next 2 bloodlines. We have both felt things accelerating and I believe Mizuki will strike tomorrow night. And your vision of giant serpents attacking the village means that it is likely that the traitor Sanin will attack soon, within a few years at the absolute most. I will be ready, my master. You have given me permission to assist the Hokage and repay the debt of my childhood. And with this I will sever the last of my ties as Uzumaki Naruto. I will be ready to claim my title and robes. With a chuckle, Revan simply responded with, "Good," and left the training room, jumping into the ceiling and replacing the tile with a wave of his hand. Mulling over ARMR's latest reports and the changes still occurring within his student's body. Even after the first experiment, side effects were planned for, but his student's seemingly constant evolution was interesting. In fact, the only reason they were going to operate on him so soon was the fact that they had to know if the boy's body would fail. That these 2 traits would strengthen his chakra coils were only a pleasant coincidence. Of course, he wouldn't be able to teach his student constantly like he had been. Oh, he'd teach him as much as he could, but he'd probably make sure the boy was secure in his mindscape, leave as many manuscripts on Sith alchemy and the Jedi techniques for making weapons as possible, and let his student work. This way he could monitor his condition in real time and allow his student to figure out a plan for making a weapon that would fit him. The fact that his student would likely end up at around 320 centimeters tall meant that normal blades would simply be too short for him. Add to that he'd need custom-fitted armor, robes, and redesigned blasters large enough for his hands. Chuckling, Revan decided it was a good thing the base had manufacturing capabilities, however limited. 16 hours later, Naruto was confident and he had good reason to be. Mizuki had apparently been hiding his true skills for quite some time. The man was considered low chunin at best and his combat skills fit in that range. But his infiltration skills, there the man truly shined. Naruto would rate the man a higher rank or low S rank in infiltration and evasion abilities. It even seemed the man was talented enough to steal multiple jutsu scrolls from secure locations, intelligent enough to target people who wouldn't report the thefts, and even skilled enough to copy techniques from others he observed. However, the man had very little skill for combat. After months of observation, a bit of mind reading, and a good dose of profiling, Naruto had estimated the man's Bukajutsu at low C rank, his Genjutsu at high D rank, and all other combat skills barely better than a genin. According to his observations, Kabuto had picked up on the man's discontent, as well as his hidden skills, and convinced him that Orochimaru would give the man power if he proved himself. Suffice to say Naruto knew that was highly unlikely. If it wasn't for the Sanin's known pastime of experimenting on living subjects, he'd expect Kabuto to have killed the man long ago. Though the fact that Mizuki had not only acquired the Scroll of Seals, but then escaped the Anbu and Root that were hunting him, long enough to reach the dead drop at least, impressed Naruto. Unfortunately for Mizuki, this meant the boy planned to slit his throat from behind rather than give him a chance to escape or fight back. And with those thoughts Naruto returned to his own mind, having been monitoring the situation through the Force, and prepared for his target to enter the clearing he was currently waiting in. Having decided to hide in a hollow formed by 3 trees having grown together, the apprentice silently readied his knife. At that very moment Mizuki appeared between in the clearing, out of breath and carrying a massive scroll. As Naruto began to creep towards his target, the boy focused his hearing on the man's muttering. "Damn Anbu, almost killed me. Thank God that idiot Iruka startled me, otherwise I'd be dead now. Course I wasn't able to finish the bastard off, but those cuts are gonna scar." With a short chuckle, the man began to stand up, ready to resume his flight. It was that exact moment Naruto struck, one hand wrapped tightly around the man's mouth, the other shoving a 30-centimeter knife into the side of his target's neck. The move followed up with a quick outward slash, ripping the man's trachea, esophagus, and vocal cords apart. Mizuki struggled for a few moments, but against the strength of the Sith it was no use. And in 10 seconds the man had entered shock, within another 10 he was dead. Securing the scroll, Naruto moved out. Not bothering to clean the body, or himself, the Force cloaking his scent, and his skills preventing a single sound alerting anyone to his presence, the apprentice had accomplished his main objective, and all that remained was to escape. A quick dash forward and a leap into the treetops, Naruto began to move as quickly as he could. The tracking teams were searching for Mizuki, and his scent wouldn't be found unless they investigated the man's corpse thoroughly enough to detect the scent of the dark side. And even then his trail would be long dead by the time they figured out where he was headed. 8 hours later, Naruto organized his thoughts, ready to once again retreat to his mindscape for a full 5 years of training. Idly, he pondered whether this meant he was still 8 or should be considered 15 at this point. After all, he had lived 15 years, perhaps not in the physical world, but the fact of the matter was that he was quite simply not a child. Frowning a bit, the boy considered how the villagers had treated him, had he ever been a child. Of course he had been scared, ignorant, and alone, but he had never been naive or unintelligent. Living on the streets tends to sharpen anyone, and even when he had a home, it was more often than not vandalized. And even with his orphan's stipend he had scavenged for food more than once. Relaxing himself, and suppressing the dark side energy that threatened to unbalance him, he turned to the present. His master had been quite pleased with the results of his mission. Even now, the scroll of seals was waiting for him in his quarters. The fact that his master was pleased with him, along with the fact that the scrolls he had stolen or salvaged over the years were waiting for him, was quite the pleasant thought. With his training, he no longer felt true emotions, and the contentment that had replaced joy would be considered strange to almost anyone, but to him it was the one positive feeling he permitted himself. And the feeling grew, ever so slightly, at the thought that when he finished this training period he would be even more powerful. Yes, the coming training would be quite useful, especially if he finally decided on his weapon. Within Naruto's mindscape, Naruto had just finished his tasks for the day, and his master had left to monitor his condition when he felt something shift. At first he looked at the beast he knew to be the Kyuubi no Yoko. For some reason he always had the feeling that it was off, but now, it felt no different. Looking around his mindscape, he noticed what appeared to be a seal now forming at the base of the altar that formed the crux of the main room of his mind. Strange symbols, a handful of which he recognized from his very basic understanding of Fuinjutsu, began to fill the air, and with a flash of bright, yellow light, energy filled the room. Now standing in the center of the room was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and somewhat tall human male. At first Naruto was interested enough to not immediately attack what appeared to be a complete stranger in his mind, and it was thanks to that moment of hesitation that he recognized the man as the Yondaime Hokage, the man his master believed to be his father, Namikaze Minato. Deciding to test his master's theory, Naruto called out, "Father?" Gasping, Minato turned to the red-skinned being who called out to him, and stuttering badly, responded with, Naruto. "Yes, my name is Uzumaki Naruto, and you are Namikaze Minato, my father, correct?" How can you be my son? I mean, I know you have to be him. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate, but what happened to you? I could ask you the same thing, you are dead, are you not? Frowning a bit, the man, in a rather mournful tone, replied, "Yes, Naruto, your mother and I both died that night. However, we sealed a portion of our chakra within you, along with the Kyuubi, in order to protect you should the Kyuubi ever try to take over, or you channeled too much of the beast's chakra for your body to handle. And I know it may seem rude, my son, but I must know how you came to be like this." With a small smile, and in a polite tone, Naruto responded, "I take no offense, father, and the answer is simple enough. I was dying. I had been chased into training ground 44 by a drunken shinobi, stumbled down an incline, and found my way to what I believed to be a treasure. At the end of my journey I was confronted by a giant bear, and in my desperation I inflicted enough structural damage to one of the construction tunnels of a hidden base to cause it to collapse. In order to keep me alive, they changed me into what I am now. And what are you, my son? I am Sith. I do not understand. But I do not have time for you to explain everything. My chakra will run out rather quickly, but if you were attacked as a child, and changed, you must lack proper shinobi training. Tell me what you know and I'll try to point you in the right direction or help fill in holes." Turning to himself, or maybe I should just give him a general overview. Astonished, Naruto couldn't help himself, he had to ask, "Why?" And to his further astonishment his father replied, "Son, clearly I failed to protect you that night. In fact, the only reason I sealed the Kyuubi within you was the fact that it would have killed literally anyone else in the village, escaped, and then killed you. I regret having to turn my own son into a Jinchuriki. And since I failed you then, I'll do everything I can now." Walking up to his much taller son, Namikaze Minato embraced his child, and right before I go, I'll call Kushina-chan up, explain everything to her, and we'll be a family for a few minutes. Naruto began to shake, he felt something warm on his face. Touching it, he realized he was crying. He hadn't cried since he had begun his training. No matter how much pain he was in, no matter what tortures were inflicted upon him, no matter what he had to do, he never cried. Reaching out, he stiffly embraced his father, knowing this was the one thing he had always wanted, his family, and it was the one thing he would never have. Frowning, he focused, bending the force to his will, hiding his emotions from his master, not wanting him to intrude on what little time he would ever have with his parents. At that, he turned back to his father, now standing a few meters away from him, inspecting the runes within his mind, and with a small smile, Naruto called out to him. 4 days later, Mindscape. "Alright Naruto-kun, that should just about cover it, and while I know you've probably memorized everything I've told you, repeat back what you need to learn once you finish with your augmentation." "Yes, father. First, I must secure theory scrolls for Genjutsu, Fuinjutsu, and if possible, advanced scrolls of Kenjutsu, Taijutsu, and Ninjutsu. The theory scrolls will allow me to begin my self-study in 2 of the most important areas of the shinobi arts, and the advanced scrolls will allow me to integrate shinobi styles into my already existing combat skills. Secondly, if and when I decide to make contact with Konoha, remember the specific code words and passphrases to inform the Hokage I am friendly. Finally, the seals and actions necessary to deactivate the protections around the Uzumaki Namikaze compound are completely memorized." "Good job Naruto-kun, now, Kushina-chan should be along in just a few minutes." And with that, a second set of seals appeared around the base of the central altar. A second, this time red, flash of light appeared, and in the center of the chamber a red-haired, violet-eyed woman now stood. "Minato-kun, why are you here? Weren't we supposed to appear at different times? And who is that?" "Hello Kushina-chan, now, I want you to take a deep breath. I have something I need to tell you and I don't think you're going to like it." "What are you talking about? And where is Naruto-kun? Unless, no, you can't be." "Yes Kushina, this is Naruto." Even though Naruto's face didn't show it, his chest was hurting. He didn't blame his mother, he knew what he looked like after all. And he couldn't really expect her to have the same reaction as his father had. With that thought he felt someone hug him. Looking down, he realized his mother had crossed about 20 meters in less than a second, impressive on its own. But the fact he hadn't even noticed until she grabbed onto him and started quietly crying almost broke him. Listening closely, he could hear her repeating one phrase over and over, "My poor baby." Considering this was the second time he had ever been hugged and that he had not only expected, but had seen the first one coming, that he stood ramrod straight and was completely unsure of what to do in this situation was understandable. Slowly hugging his mother back, he began to speak, to explain what he had become. "Mother, I know I look strange, but I promise that this was what was best for me. I had been injured and I was changed in order to save my life." Hiccuping, Kushina regained control of herself and began to speak. "Oh my poor child. How were you injured? Hiruzen should have protected you, he should have had Anbu watching over you. And who did this to you? But first, you aren't in any pain, are you?" "Of course not, mother. In fact, I feel great. I am blessed with healing, beyond even that of a Jinchuriki. As to who did this to me, well, I truly do not know how best to explain what he is. Perhaps you should think of him as a very, very advanced puppet. One that could think for himself. And he goes by the name ARMR, an acronym, one that stands for Advanced Rehabilitation and Medical Research Facility. Finally, to answer how I was injured, it is somewhat embarrassing. I awoke our chakra chains and caused a collapse of a tunnel and ended up being almost crushed by a giant bear." Smiling for the first time since her appearance, "I'm so happy you inherited my adamantine sealing chains. How far along have you come with them? Do they look just like mine? And how does the Biju chakra affect your chains?" And Minato, chuckling, interrupted the conversation. Now Kushina-chan, give the boy some space. You'll have plenty of time to discuss his powers once I'm gone." Blushing, Kushina did just that, pulling back from her son, of course. Sorry about that, Naruto-kun. Anyways, why don't you start telling us about how things have gone for you? And tell us all about your teacher. And so Naruto did. For the rest of the day he talked to his parents. Simply spending time with them. They would tell him stories and amusing anecdotes about their friends and he did his best to understand them. Considering he had only left the base on missions, he had very few stories he could tell them about his own life, but he did share what he could of Revan's adventures. In the beginning they were rather confused by the concept of there being an entire galaxy filled with sentient beings, but Naruto's memories of the advanced technology and the few pictures he had seen of aliens convinced them. After that day had passed, Minato had run out of chakra, and disappeared after adding on that Naruto should find some chakra paper when he next went out. And while he was saddened, he kept up his mask, spending as much time as he could with his mother. It was most definitely time well spent, with his mother helping to refine his chains, explain what she knew of the Uzumaki clan, and explaining quite a bit more about Fuinjutsu. And it wasn't enough for him, he felt unfulfilled. For the first time in his life he had been part of the one thing he had always desired. And now it would be ripped away from him. But rather than brood he threw himself into his training. With his master bringing him more work every day that passed in the real world, Naruto never lacked for materials. And with his focus now on building up his shinobi skills he felt he would need far more than the 5 years the accelerated time in his mindscape would give him. 48 BBY Month 1. Finally, he was ready. After his augmentations were complete it had taken him a full month to grow used to his new strength and reach his old level of skill and proficiency. But now he had finally stopped bumping into tables and breaking every glass he picked up. Rather significantly, he was strong enough that training droids were no longer useful. He would simply rip them apart or crush them with anything but his lightest blows, and his master lacked the rapid healing he possessed, limiting his physical training. But that simply meant his force and shinobi training had been taken to a new level. He had mastered the force cloak ability along with a few other powers, and his shinobi training had exploded forward by leaps and bounds. At first he had only been able to learn the clone techniques and a few variations on them. However, once he had mastered the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, he began to create massive swarms of shadow clones to train in the other techniques. In order to counter the mental fatigue he simply began meditating for several hours a day. Which in turn allowed him to process the massive numbers of clones, dispelling and strengthened his mental resistance as well. All of which had led to his confidence in this mission, securing the mask of the Shinigami, freeing his father's soul, and absorbing the yin half of the Kyuubi. Mentally reviewing his equipment: belt of throwing knives, boot knife, 2 Durasteel short swords, gray robes and armor. Simple and light, he wasn't attacking an enemy base, but dodging patrols and slipping past defensive lines. With a final review of the route he was planning to take and his escape routes in case the mission went bad, he was prepared. Opening the cover to the tunnel that led into the base he quickly took to the trees, ready to attack anyone who may have seen him leave. Sensing no one nearby, he pulsed his chakra, confirming that no entities with more chakra than would be expected from a small insect were present. Moving quickly he began hopping from tree to tree, dashing through the forest and relying on his force cloak and speed to hide him from any possible observers. It had taken him a full 3 hours to slip past the gates of Konoha, the exact same 2 Chunin on guard as always. Though Naruto did wonder why those 2 were always the gate guards. Did they possess enhanced senses or resistance to genjutsu? Maybe some technique that would allow them to detect lies, or maybe just a set of skills that allowed them to notice the slightest discrepancies in documentation? After all, a military village would never post 2 incompetents at the main entrance to their village. Hell, considering they were ninja, the pair were probably ex-Anbu who were masters at suppressing their own strength. And if they were tasked with serving as the first line of defense, Naruto did not wish to be forced into battle with 2 individuals who were clearly village elites. Of course, the much higher numbers of fake Anbu running around hadn't helped things either. All of this had Naruto's instincts all but screaming at him that something was going to happen. And considering this happened after he spoke to his parents, while he had no doubt that this was somehow connected to the shift in the Kyuubi's chakra. Possibly something to do with the fact his own reserves had grown as well. Though he had nothing to compare them to, his father believed he was likely close to absorbing all of the yang chakra. meaning he was closing in on the level of the Hachibi Biju, without considering his own insane reserves from his upgraded body. So it was not inconceivable he had set off emergency seals, even with him suppressing as much of his chakra as he could. Thankfully he had reached the temple already and was now detecting at least 15 chakra signatures either stationed around or approaching the ruins. Luckily, only 3 of them were of any significance, though one did feel very, very strange. Almost like 2 people in one body, with multiple areas of heightened chakra along one of the individual's arms. Strange, but not a great cause for worry. And since it would be pointless to try talking his way past these people, considering they were all dressed like the fake Anbu, Naruto drew his twin blades and prepared himself for battle. Dropping down from the tree he was hiding in, he broke out of cover, charging a group of 4 ninja. The first 2 died easily, his swords through their throats, and the fallen ninja choking on their own blood. The next 2 ninja, one a shinobi, the other a kunoichi, launched themselves towards Naruto, drawing a kunai and chikudo respectively. Dropping into a low stance, Naruto parried the kunai and blocked the sword. Locking his blades with his enemy's weapons, stepping forward, and slamming downwards, he used his superior strength to overpower his foe and drive the locked blades into her body. With the kunoichi killed by her own weapon, and her arms broken even if she still lived, he turned to his next opponent. The shinobi jumped back, moving to join the second squad of ninja to arrive at the temple. Deciding to avoid fighting near or within such a fragile structure, Naruto took to the trees, leading his opponents to a safer battleground. After a short run he stopped in the middle of a clearing. About 50 meters end to end and relatively flat and even, Naruto decided this would be the best place to engage his opponents. Turning about and letting the hood of training robes fall, he noticed that all but the 3 strongest of his opponents had arrived. As a group the shinobi moved, 3 forward and 3 to each of his sides. Stopping roughly 10 meters away, the 3 charging slip into a set of hand seals. The first calls out Kaden, Enden, the second Raiden, Reijeki, and the third Fuuden, Rinkuden, the 3 techniques combining to form a stream of lightning-enhanced liquid fire, burning at temperatures so high the flames were blue and white instead of red and yellow. Reaching out with the force, Naruto grabbed the incoming flames and gathered them. Focusing as much energy as he could, he launched the volatile mixture back at the 3 stunned shinobi, catching the group with their own technique. Luckily for the shinobi, they all died instantly, the flames burning through their skin, boiling the fat in their bodies, vaporizing the water in their blood, and ripping their bones apart long before they felt any pain. The other 2 squads immediately launched barrages of projectiles, trying to overwhelm Naruto with the sheer number of weapons thrown. Using a force-enhanced jump to dodge, Naruto found himself sinking to the ground, now turned into quicksand. Substituting with a nearby branch, he found himself overlooking 6 now evenly spread shinobi, all with weapons drawn and with one hand forming a seal. Sensing the 3 stronger enemies approaching, and rapidly at that, Naruto prepared his throwing knives, intending to finish off the remaining shinobi in the next clash. With a flick of his wrist Naruto launched 6 of his throwing knives while slipping through the seals for the shuriken cage bunshin, silently multiplying his weapons by a factor of 20. The remaining root attempted to block the oncoming knives with a combination of earth jutsu, however the sheer power behind each weapon and the strength of the durasteel blades ripped through the hastily erected barriers, skewering the 6 ninja. Pulsing his chakra to confirm the kills, Naruto felt the 3 strongest shinobi approaching the edge of the clearing. Sighing, he decided it would be best to meet them in the open, no sense letting them dictate the engagement, and the previous fight had been rather boring. Grinning, Naruto decided he was going to have a bit of fun. Jumping into the center of the clearing and turning his back to where he knew his enemies would come from, Naruto couldn't stop a dark chuckle from rumbling through him as he slipped his mask off and attached it to his belt. Shimura Danzo was not in a good mood. He had barely finished with that bastard Orochimaru the day before and now his men were being butchered. Sighing, Danzo chided himself, "I knew that traitor would try something. I knew he was after the mask. At least my men were able to drive him back for a bit. It was a shame losing those squads though. They might not have been my best men, but they were some of my most effective units." Calming himself, Danzo returned to the task at hand. After about 15 minutes of running, he and his 2 men had reached the clearing his men had been led to. Upon arriving, the first thing he noticed was the smell of burnt flesh, and after a few seconds, the almost completely destroyed remains of what looked like 3 of his ninja. Moving into the clearing itself, he then noticed the large man standing with his back to the now approaching shinobi. And by large, he meant large. The man was at least 230 centimeters, maybe more, and broad. Frankly, this was probably the largest person Danzo had ever seen, and most likely not Orochimaru. If for no other reason than the ground-length gray robes and the strange, almost samurai-like, armor he was wearing. Deciding it would be best to gather information on his unknown opponent, Danzo gestured for his 2 shinobi to break off and take up flanking positions while he stepped forward. "Who are you and why have you attacked my men?" While he wasn't expecting the man to reveal who he was or who he was working for, he did not expect the man to simply turn around and drop the hood of his robes. Eyes widening, Danzo was terrified. The thing looked like it had once been the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi, if those whiskers were anything to go by, and the fact that he could see hints of Minato and Kushina in the creature's facial structure seemed to make a mockery of the Yondaime Hokage and his wife. After that, the thing smiled, its facial tendrils curling up as its lips parted, revealing far too many black, pointed teeth. Reacting, Danzo decided this monster was worth risking his new arm. Ripping the bandages over his face and arm away, he ordered his subordinates to attack. Mizunoto, attack. Now. Hi, Danzo-sama. Preparing a fire jutsu, Danzo continued his charge, intending to hit his target at point-blank range. But what happened next stopped him cold. 2 of his best root, both kenjutsu masters, had their swords stopped by this thing's hands. And in that moment of shock, the creature attacked, grabbing the swords of both men and yanking them forward. As soon as they were in range, he reached over and grabbed both by their faces, crushing their masks, and slammed them into the ground. Danzo could only watch in horror as their faces were caved in by the impact, reducing their heads to a pulpy red mess. It was at that moment a terrible calm overcame him, almost as if every emotion he had ever felt had been an illusion. Calmly jumping in zigzag pattern, he rapidly ran through 2 sets of one-hand seals, first shouting out Fuuten, Shinku Taigoku, and with his next breath Mokuton, exploding tree spear. The combo was simple: wait for the opponent to dodge or counter the blast of wind chakra and then let the swarm of roots impale them. What he was not expecting was for his right arm to severed in the next moment, the creature standing behind him, holding his arm, and black claws shining in moonlight thanks to the coating of Danzo's own blood. Knowing his only chance at survival was to use Izanagi, he swiftly activated the power, sacrificing his most powerful eye, but surviving. After a second he had reformed, now blind in his right eye, but once again in possession of his Sharingan implanted arm. Activating all of them, he rushed forward, unsealing his sword from his gauntlets as he charged. The thing clashed with him, easily parrying every blow he struck. However, his goal wasn't to defeat the monster with kenjutsu, but to lure the creature close enough to destroy with his Ura-Shisho Fuin. His Izanagi would allow him to escape and the monster would be slain in one blow. Noticing a slight misstep with the creature placing his foot into a dip in the ground, Danzo struck. Activating Izanagi and promptly impaling himself on the creature's sword, the last thing he felt was the Ura-Shisho Fuin activating. As with his arm, everything went dark before he phased back into reality, with another Sharingan blind, and staring at a massive black sphere, no longer feeling that monster's chakra, faint as it was. He leaned back onto a tree, deciding to rest before summoning more root. And it was at that exact moment he heard chuckling and thump as something hit the ground behind him. Naruto had to admit, he was impressed. This man, Danzo, if Naruto was reading his mind correctly, had endured a focused burst of force and sanity and hadn't done anything aside from breathing a bit harder. That the man had then had the presence of mind to order his subordinates to attack and prepare his own techniques meant that Naruto started paying attention. When the man somehow regenerated his arm, teleported, and replenished his reserves with a single technique, whose only cost seemed to be one of his Sharingan, Naruto cracked a smile. Of course he wasn't stupid, he had swapped out with a shadow clone the second the man reacted to his soldier's gruesome death. Hell, that was whole point of killing those men in such a brutal fashion. His father had warned him about the man and mentioned it was highly likely he knew several suicide techniques, so Naruto decided to play it safe. It wasn't like he wouldn't get the memories later. And it wasn't like he'd been lounging around either. A pair of shadow clones retrieving his weapons and burning his earlier kills meant he'd be free to leave once he was done with Danzo. But that suicide technique had truly surprised him. Using his resurrection technique and suicide technique together is something no one would expect or plan for, if only because the former seemed to be unique to this man, and well hidden as his father had no knowledge of such an ability. With a small smile, Naruto dropped to the ground, unleashing the Force insanity once again. And his smile almost disappeared when the man froze, but it returned twice as big when the man vomited wind chakra over his sword and struck out at twice as fast as he had been attacking. It was when his blades met the wind chakra-coated sword and began to crack that Naruto decided that this man might take too long to kill. While he wasn't a threat to Naruto, Danzo could still come back to life several more times, and Naruto wasn't sure when Anbu would arrive to investigate the earlier battles. Deciding to end the fight right then and there, Naruto lashed out with the Force, launching Danzo through several trees with a telekinetic blow. Before the man could recover, Naruto launched himself forward, cratering the ground once again, and severed the man's mutated arm. Immediately spinning on his heel, Naruto turned into his blow and with a perfect horizontal slash, decapitated the man he had been fighting. Watching as Danzo fell to his knees and then toppled over, Naruto was already in motion. Quickly, he grabbed Danzo's severed limbs and jumped back as the Ura Shisho Fuin activated once again. As he had absolutely no way to cover up the seal's activation, Naruto simply used his earth manipulation to bury the remains several dozen meters underground. Deciding the limbs would have too much potential to waste, especially all those eyes, Naruto wrapped them up with part of his rough-spun cloak and moved out, fully intending to acquire the other half of the Kyuubi before the night was over. 15 minutes later, Naruto had made it back to the temple and had found the needed mask. And while he was not looking forward to disemboweling himself, he did have the advantage that it would heal before he bled to death. So, with a small frown, he removed the top half of his robes, his mask, and his upper armor, while drawing one of his swords and placing the Uzumaki mask over his face. When the Shinigami appeared, Naruto could not fight the shiver that ran up his spine. He felt this death god through the Force and as a chakra entity. Deciding to be rather quick about his mission, he disemboweled himself, freeing several souls from the stomach of the god, and grabbed the soul of his father. Teasing the yin chakra from his father's soul, Naruto found it rather interesting that the manipulation of the soul was such a simple thing. In fact, he had expected this entire ordeal to be far more unpleasant. And even as he merged the yin half of the Kyuubi with his body, the sensations were only mildly unpleasant, feeling as if he had been shocked and then exposed to a burst of rather cold air. But considering he was fusing with half of the most powerful chakra entity to exist, well, he was a bit disappointed. Redressing and making sure all of his equipment was secured took less than 5 minutes. In 10 he made it back to the gates of Konoha, now with a group of 6 seemingly Chunin-level guards. And as when he slipped past the guards on his way out, he threw up a force cloak, blocked any sounds or smells from escaping, and took his time sneaking past the gate guards. Thankfully, none of the shinobi noticed him slipping between the group, and not a single one even blinked when he ran a bit of force energy through his limbs and took off. With the root in hiding, thanks to all the Anbu running about, Naruto was able to move much more quickly, allowing him to reach his base within only a few hours. Revan was tired. For more than 3 years he had fought against the growing corruption within him. And the worst thing was that he knew what it was, or at least he had an idea. It was as if the dark side of the Force was slipping into his thoughts, yet it was not. This corruption had purpose and direction. It targeted his memories, warped them, and tried to drive him closer and closer to insanity with every step. To his knowledge, the Force had no such direction, even if it did occasionally direct the paths of those sensitive to it. But he was not feared and worshipped as one of the greatest without reason. Even now he fought the corruption, even now he trained his student. Though the boy was already reaching the point that Revan would have little left to offer him. Perhaps a bit of help or a small push in the right direction for some of the more obscure powers, but even then the boy would likely surpass him in a matter of months. Maybe it was time to give the boy Surik's holocron. Considering he had already mastered the use of Shatterpoint and the Death Field, while understanding the theory for both the Force Rebirth and Force Devour abilities. Revan was dithering. Naruto could be said to have mastered all of Sion's and Nilla's unique powers, and their holocrons no longer held value for his training. Yes, after he was finished with this mission he would give the boy the holocron and prepare the materials for the making of the boy's sword. Feeling his student's presence within the base, Revan moved to see about the boy's mission, but was surprised when Armr began to speak. "Ah, Master, there seems to have been an emergency." "What's wrong?" "The young master has fallen unconscious and his chakra has visibly manifested." Without wasting another moment, Revan leapt forward, channeling the force through his limbs and moving as swiftly as he could. "Armr, what happened?" "I apologize, Master, but I detected no anomalies in the young master's vitals." Grunting, Revan skidded to a halt outside of the medical bay. As the doors opened he saw the child writhing on the floor, coated in the red energy of the beast he contained. Taking in every little detail of the scene, the six tails, the fact that the boy's skin seemed to have burned off, and that his student's armor and weapons had been damaged by the energy. That this power was enough to eat through Durasteel and yet his student did not cry out brought a powerful feeling of pride to Revan's heart, as well as a murmur of fear. A single thought: if he's this strong, how strong will he become? Strong enough to slay me, as all Sith slay their masters, slipped into his mind. Stopping in his movement, Revan centered himself, turned his powers inward, and drove the thought out. Once he was ready, the old conqueror channeled the force into his hands and picked his student up. Ignoring the flecks of energy, the burned spots on his skin, Revan dashed forward, moving towards the medical bay, fully intent on saving his apprentice. Naruto was in a rather intense amount of pain. Not as much as when he had been tortured by his master, but still a rather significant degree of discomfort. However, he knew that this most likely had something to do with taking half of a Biju into his body. And after cursing his earlier disappointment in the lack of a serious event upon his merging, he focused through the pain and made his way into his mindscape. Finding himself standing in what he now recognized as a Sith tomb, he looked about. Runes covered the walls, easily half of them were black with the rest being a dark purple closer to red than black. Strangely enough, a new set of runes were seemingly being carved underneath those currently there. Deciding to ignore this, as it was most likely his body assimilating the rest of the Kyuubi, he moved forward. Noticing a few other changes, the statues seemed to have gained features and now seemed to be holding swords. Naruto realized something rather significant must have happened, or would happen once this confrontation was over. And upon reaching the central chamber of his mind, he immediately noticed the massive red fox screaming and raging about in the pit around the central dais. Deciding to observe his opponent, and he had little doubt he would have to subdue the beast, he noticed thin streams of chakra tying the beast to the dais, as well as the fact that the Kyuubi seemed to be mostly orange instead of the red he had been expecting. Finally, having looked enough, he walked into the room proper and introduced himself. "Hello, I am Uzumaki Namikaze Naruto." "Who are you?" "Ninjin." "Release me at once." "Why would I do that?" "So that I might devour you." "And how would that benefit me?" "Silence, whelp. I am the great Kyuubi no Yoko, and you will do as I say." Deciding that the beast was likely going to only continue to rage, what with its clear superiority complex, Naruto figured the best, or at least most entertaining, thing to do would be to screw with it. And with that he replied with a simple, "No," and promptly sat down in a meditative pose. After several hours of the beast continuing to threaten and bluster, Naruto had managed to rein in the chakra that his body had been venting and deal with most of the damage. Frowning, he hoped he hadn't destroyed the eyes he had recovered. It was at that moment he noticed that the room was strangely quiet. Figuring the Kyuubi was finally ready to talk, or fight for dominance, Naruto stood up and walked onto the central dais. Lowering and turning his head, the Kyuubi began to speak to Naruto. "Ninjin, I have seen your memories, your powers, and your fears. I know that my powers are bound to your flesh and not some piece of paper." Frowning, Naruto replied, "And why should that matter to me?" At this the Kyuubi began to chuckle, "Because you pathetic human, that means all I have to do is devour you and this body becomes mine." With his threat the Kyuubi turned his eye on Naruto and flashed his fangs. Responding, Naruto channeled the force through his body, creating a dark miasma around his body and causing his eyes to glow a bright yellow. If you have truly seen my memories, you know I am no human beast, spat Naruto in return. Ha, at least you have some spark, ninjin. But that will not be enough to save you. Now come, let us fight, and I shall give you a warrior's death. Very well, beast, I shall enjoy claiming your mind once I am finished with you. And with that the central chamber began to shift, the walls expanding, the dais lowering, and what seemed to be an arena forming. After a few minutes a wide space, 200 meters square and at least that high, had been formed for the pair to do battle in. Seeing this, the Kyuubi remarked, sporting a grin, convenient. Naruto responded with a silent charge. With a roar, the Kyuubi launched his tails at Naruto, trying to either crush or impale the young Sith. Weaving past each strike, Naruto began to actually close on the great fox itself. Seeing his foe approaching, the Kyuubi reared back, preparing to crush Naruto with both hands. Naruto, planning to strike first, fired off several blasts of telekinetic energy. However, when the blows struck the beast's head and then promptly dissipated, he frowned. Unfortunately for him, that was the very moment the Kyuubi struck. Seeing the two massive hands coming for him, Naruto launched himself backwards with a force-enhanced leap and slipped into a ready stance. Figuring that the creature's nature as a being of chakra granted it a rather significant resistance to direct force attacks, Naruto decided the only thing to do would be to hit it with as many high-powered chakra attacks as possible. Silently and seallessly he created 20 shadow clones who each formed the Tori seal and called out Suiryuden no Jutsu. At this 20 water dragons launched themselves at the great fox, placing the chakra entity on the defensive. Taking this opportunity to slip away, Naruto created another clone, swapped with it using Kawarimi, and promptly used a combination of Force Cloak and Force Invisibility to slip into a more advantageous position. The water dragons strike and stagger the Kyuubi, but after a second the great fox pulses its chakra and counters with a massive blast of flames. 4 clones are destroyed but the remaining 17 charge the Kyuubi, dodging between the tails once again. The Kyuubi, growing frustrated, launches himself back and begins charging chakra at the end of each of his tails. After a massive ball easily half the size of the Biju itself is formed, the Kyuubi swallows the mass of chakra, and promptly swells up to ridiculous proportions before unleashing a massive beam of destruction straight at the original Naruto. Eyes widening, Naruto launched himself to the side with a force-enhanced leap, reaching and sticking to the wall on the western side of the arena. Silly ninjin, did you really think your tricks would protect you from me? Ignoring the taunts and the well of anger building inside of him, Naruto created another 20 clones, his previous force being completely wiped out by the Bijudama, and dropped from the wall, ordering his clones to spread out. So you've finally decided you're ready to die, little boy. Well, it's about time. Gritting his teeth, Naruto bit out, "Silence, beast, I will break you." Channeling as much of his anger as he could, Naruto began his attack. Weaving through dozens of blows, substituting with half of his clones, and barely reaching the beast without being impaled, Naruto revealed his trump card. With a single thought and a massive roar, hundreds of chakra chains launched themselves from the 10 remaining shadow clones, piercing and binding the great beast. And then began draining the fox's chakra into themselves. With a roar that shook his mindscape, the Kyuubi began speaking, "You damn ninjin, how do you have these chains?" Now with a small, but noticeable, smirk on his face, Naruto began to taunt his opponent. "You didn't really think I'd allow you to just look through my memories, did you? My master can read minds just by being on the same planet as his target, and he has taught me the value of secrets. My mind is my own, beast." Roaring once again, the Kyuubi began to struggle, desperately trying to break free from the chains binding him. Naruto calmly walked up to the great fox, jumped onto his snout, and spoke a final few words to the great creature. "Hold still, this is probably going to hurt. Drain knowledge." At this, Naruto slammed his left hand into the forehead of the Kyuubi, almost as if he was searching for something. And after a few moments he found what he was looking for and memories began to slip into his mind. At first it was his most recent fight, then it was memories of his birth and the destruction of Konoha, all from the Kyuubi's point of view. On and on it went, the beast's imprisonment within its Jinchuriki, the fox's life for the 2,000 years before that, its siblings, but most importantly, its birth. Naruto could not stop his eyes from widening, The beast had a name, Kurama. His father was the Rikudo Sennin. All of the tailed beasts were part of a construct known as the Jubi, and the Jubi was actually Otsutsuki Kagaya fused with a tree. The young Sith couldn't help it, he laughed. How could he not? Apparently the source of all the power of his world was an alien and a bloody tree. And the best thing was that Kurama even remembered bits and pieces of technology, now long lost, that would have been right at home in his master's era. Looking at the great fox, Naruto realized its eyes had become completely blank. Perfect white orbs staring out into his mindscape while small tendrils of the chakra making up the Kyuubi's body continuously drifted into the now reformed central dais. Focusing, Naruto jumped onto the dais and took a meditative stance. Ready to sort through so many memories and sporting a highly unusual grin, the benefits of managing several thousand shadow clones were the last words to echo in his mind. 48 BBY Month 3. With a groan, Naruto woke up. His whole body seemed to be cramping up and everything was sore. Running a bit of force energy through his body, he slowly stretched out on his bed. After taking a few minutes to make sure everything was in order, he sat up, and with a questioning tone he spoke aloud for the first time, "ARMR. Ah, young master, it is a pleasure to see you awake. I shall inform the master that you will soon be ready to meet with him." "Thank you ARMR, but could you please explain what happened to me?" "Of course young master. After returning from your mission you collapsed within the armory. After a few moments you began to violently release large quantities of chakra, damaging your armor and weapons I'm afraid, and then fell unconscious." "Understood. Was my equipment salvageable?" "I am quite sorry young master, but the only salvageable weapons were your throwing knives. Though the severed head and arm you had with you were both secured and escaped without significant damage or decay." "Were there any changes in the status of the eyes in particular?" "Yes sir. The eyes that had previously been blind have now taken a black and red design, with 7 of the eyes possessing a unique pattern. This occurred during the time you were releasing a great deal of chakra. Would you like to review the security footage?" "No, not right now. However, I do wish for you to begin coding the genetic structure of each eye, the head, and the arm. Each one should have a different genetic structure, though it is possible, if not highly likely, that the eyes are paired. Once I have time I will investigate it myself. But for now where is my master?" With that the door to the medical bay opened and Revan strode in. Moving quickly, Naruto leapt out of bed and dropped to a knee before his master. "My master," the body uttered, showing that even after a 2-month coma he was still quite capable of movement. "Apprentice, I take it your mission was successful?" "Yes, my master." "Good. We're running out of time and as such, I have decided you are ready for Surik's holocron. Survive her test and you'll be one step closer to finishing your training. Now come, we have little time." With that, Revan turned back into hallway. Naruto quickly stood and followed his master and the pair walked in silence for several minutes. Coming to one of the training rooms, unused up to this point, and Naruto could feel something within. It felt like a wound in the force, almost as if it was a place the force could no longer go. Yet that was not quite it. It was as if the force refused to enter the room. For the first time since he had been reborn, Naruto felt unease. "Master, what is in that room?" "That, my apprentice, is a force echo. Survive it and you shall gain powers even I cannot hope to match. But I warn you, it shall not be a pleasant experience." "I understand, my master." And with his final words said, Naruto opened the door and stepped into the room. The entirety of the area was pitch black, so dark that the light from the corridor barely moved a few inches into the gloom. It was with his first few steps that Naruto realized he could no longer sense things beyond his own and body. At that very moment the door shut and locked in the darkness. Naruto shivered. This was the first time in a very long time he had felt fear. Yet the emotion itself was strange, as if coming from a great distance, not from within his own mind. Creating a small ball of fire-natured chakra in his hand, he walked forward. The darkness itself was clearly unnatural, likely a thing of the dark side. Thinking to himself, Naruto decided it was trying to isolate the echo, preventing others from approaching the source. Moving forward the feelings of unease increased and he began to both hear movement and see flashes of shadows that almost seemed alive, but always on the edge of his vision. In response, he flared his Yuki, driving back the darkness and granting him a reprieve from the spirits that haunted this darkness. After an unknowable amount of time walking, Naruto heard chanting, building slowly as he continued forward, but certainly growing. Once he could make out the individual words, Naruto realized he had never heard this language in all of his training. And his master had imparted knowledge of languages a humanoid physically could not speak. As he came to what seemed to be a ritual chamber, he received his first look at the beings chanting. 15 tall and luminous creatures, lacking all features, stood arrayed in a line. From his left they went from black to red to gray to blue to white, and all of the beings seemed to be chanting the unknown language straight into his head. Each seemed to be 3 times his height, identical to all the others, save for its color, and they all radiated enough force energy to nearly burn Naruto's mind from his body. As he stopped walking, he felt one of the creatures, the one from the very center he believed, begin speaking to him. End this path, creature, for should you walk this path all shall be undone. With the being's words it seemed as if the very world itself shook, with Naruto falling to one knee. Why should I not walk this path? The young Sith cried out. You walk the path of the gods. And you do not have our blessing. Naruto, feeling his mind begin to slip, stood up. I am no creature and I fear no gods. Then we shall destroy you and preserve the balance. With that the being fused together, forming a massive serpent, easily many kilometers long, and with a maw of fangs 10 times the length of Naruto's body. Seeing the creature bearing down upon him, Naruto unleashed a bestial roar and called up all of the Yuki and chakra within his body. As the creature came closer, a blood-red cloak of chakra sprang up around him, with what looked like the body of a massive fox quickly forming over his cloak. Moments before the serpent struck, a truly awe-inspiring sight of a kilometer-tall blood-red fox with 9 tails, massive spikes coming from the joints of its forelimbs, and glowing yellow eyes stood in defiance of the creature. At this the serpent hesitated, and in that moment changes continued to take place. Its claws, spikes, and teeth blackening, the eyes beginning to glow a darker red, and spike forming on the fox's shoulders, down its spine, and its rib cage solidifying. Seeing the creature before them, the spirits forming the serpent had only a single thought: the creature is born of our old rivals. Rivals we had surely slain to the last. Driving out the thoughts of the only beings to have ever truly challenged them, the spirits pushed their shared form forward, fully intent on devouring the great fox before them. At this Naruto launched himself backwards, launching a wave of fire from his mouth. The serpent split itself apart into 15 separate beings, each taking on the form of a winged insect with strange golden bone plates on their heads, and launched themselves at the great fox. Launching himself into the air, Naruto formed the ram hand seal and created 4 shadow clones of his fox form. As the clones fell, they grabbed the original and threw him away from the main fight. However, the spirits were idle during this time. The group of insects converged on one of the clones, burrowing into the fox's arm, before combining once again and shifting into a monstrous lizard this time. The remaining shadow clones immediately began going through a series of hand seals, with the first 2 being Tori Itatsu, with the first clone ending with Inu, the second with another Tori, and the third with Asaru. Finished, the clones each spit a massive elemental dragon at the spirits, and with a roar shout, "Dragons dance!" 3 elements. As the dragons rocket forward, the first, made of wind, clashes with the second, made with fire, and the resulting jutsu is so large the third, made of lightning, is quickly absorbed. The resulting technique is a white-blue elemental dragon easily a kilometer long and on a direct course for the spirit's current location. Unsure of the range of the technique, the spirits opt to counter with a blast of pure force energy. In a matter of seconds the lizard rears up on its hind legs, shifts its forelegs into arms, and began to concentrate a mass of force energy into its hands. Within a moment a massive black spear had formed in the creature's hands, and with a cry of "Darkshear," the attack was launched forward. As the 2 attacks came together, the combatants were already preparing their defenses. The 3 clones expended their remaining chakra, forming a dome of earth around the original. Trusting in the sheer power they could bring to bear, the spirits formed a dome of telekinetically reinforced air around themselves. And only a moment after the enemies had finished preparing, the blows met. And it was pure destruction. A wave of energy, a bright blinding white, expanded from the meeting point, consuming everything in its path. The chamber the enemies seemed to be in shook and almost collapsed, unleashing their attack on the real world. Seeing what was happening, the spirits grabbed onto the very fabric of their unreality and held fast. After what seemed to be a day or more, everything calmed. It was with the calm that the spirits realized something. They had completely forgotten about the original. There it stood, a massive ball of chakra, easily 5 times it on size, hovering above its maw. And with what looked like a grin, the fox swallowed the energy, bloating to comic proportions. Its arms and legs were like twigs coming of its obscenely swollen body, yet it somehow seemed to be perfectly fine. As the spirits were so shocked, they failed to take advantage of this opportunity and paid for it most dearly. A wave of red energy spewed forth from the maw of the great fox and crashed into the spirits. Under the force of so much energy, so inherently antithetical to the force, the spirits began to wither. One by one they faded, until only 2 remained and the Bijudama faded. At that moment one more slipped away, so it was only a single spirit that bore witness to the being who had crushed them so thoroughly. And that spirit saw the young Sith simply continue on his way, ignoring the fact that their battle would have leveled half a continent had it occurred in the real world. Looking around, Naruto realized he was about 5 meters away from the entrance of the training room and that the shadows were now gone. Searching the room, the only thing he noticed was the holocron sitting on a pedestal in the center of the room. Ultimately deciding to attribute his battle to the force screwing with him, his master mentioned it would do that occasionally. He walked up to and activated the holocron. As a gray image flickered into being, Naruto made sure to memorize every detail. The woman was shortish, 170 centimeters at most, with shoulder-length brown hair, a plain face, and smiling brown eyes. Frankly, she looked incredibly average. But even as a fragment of a spirit embedded into a holocron, Naruto could feel her power. Nowhere near his level or the level of his master, but great nonetheless. As an organic, she would likely be a close second to his master's power. Eventually, the hologram raised an eyebrow at his staring and began to speak. "Well, young Sith, do you find me that pleasing to look at? If so, I must admit myself flattered. I had few admirers in life and even fewer in death." Dropping to his knee, so as not to offend his new teacher, Naruto responded, "I apologize, my lady, I meant no offense." Laughing, the hologram responded, "Oh, I take no offense, especially not from my greatest success. As I feel my work within you, young one. Yes, my lady, I was gravely injured as a child and it was your machines that healed me. And gave me the form I take now. Well then, would you like to learn how to create more?" "My lady, what do you mean? Why, since you praised my droids so, I thought your first lesson might be on Mechujuru. Though you shall have to pass my trial first. I warn you, my test is most unpleasant. I shall endure it, my lady." "Good, I believe you shall. Now rise and prepare yourself, young Sith." Naruto stood and readied himself for what would come. With every second that passed he could feel the force growing more and more distant. Slipping away from him. Frowning, he felt a pain in his body grow. It felt as if something was tugging at every centimeter of his skin at once, and the feeling was growing far more unpleasant rather quickly. It was at the end of several minutes of growing discomfort that he felt a searing pain explode within his brain. It felt as if all of his senses were being forcefully shut down, and yet the pain brought clarity. As the pain grew, so did his understanding. He was experiencing existence without the force clouding his perceptions. And he understood that was what it did, for the force had a will, even if it was not actively directed against you. It was in the throes of that mix of pain and enlightenment that he finally understood the nature of the force. At the end of what seemed to be hours of ever-growing pain, it all finally stopped. And in that blessed stillness Naruto finally fell unconscious. With the silent presence of a dead Dark Lord of the Sith as his only guardian, he slept, and he prepared. Naruto stood silently, his 3-meter frame bearing the weight of a huge mass of metal. Gently he lowered the long bars into what looked to be a wide trough, filled with brightly glowing coals. Pushing the force into the metal sitting before him, he began to chant in a guttural and harsh language. At that moment the coals began to glow brighter, flames began to spark up between them, and the metal began to glow. As the chanting rose higher and higher, the metal began to melt into form, but just before the steel would be unrecoverable, Naruto directed his mind to the glowing mass. Using nothing but his power to direct the now liquid metal, fully encased by blinding white flames that even then blackened and damaged the crucible holding them. It began to slowly spin. It was at that moment a shadow clone, carrying a second bar of metal, entered into the forest clearing where Naruto had made his crude forge. Stopping for a moment to both observe and to divine the correct moment to introduce his payload, the clone noted the fire-hardened clay making up the outside of the crucible was cracking from the heat, and it was likely the metal lining was warping and deforming as well. The grass in the 20-meter clearing was dying, both from the flames, even now starting small fires, and the dark power being channeled into the metal. Hearing the sound that would signal him to introduce the chakra steel to the mix, the clone stepped forward and allowed the metal to drop into the center of the dancing liquid steel. The second the two materials touched, they almost seemed to explode, the crucible visibly cracking, and a definite fire starting in the clearing. As the flames around them spread, the steel before Naruto and his shadow clone grew brighter still. Within, the two metals mixed, impurities were visibly burnt out, and the steel itself blackened and twisted. A form appearing that was guided both by the chant and the dark powers infused in its forging. Sensing the chakra steel weakening, Naruto signaled his clone to begin channeling chakra into the mix. At this, the competing powers seemed to attack each other, battling for dominance over the forming sword. In that moment, a second shadow clone appeared and ran a claw over the skin of the original, drawing blood. Turning and channeling chakra into a small square of paper, a small barrel appeared. Cracking the lid open, the clone turned and placed it below the bleeding wound. At the very moment the fresh blood touched the older blood held within the barrel, the fire around them rushed forwards, seemingly merging with the flames holding the metal. In the very next second the blood rushed forward from the barrel, and the hiss of the fluid touching the metal was clearly heard over the still chanting original. And as they chanted, the flames spread, stretching outwards, onwards, constantly seeking new fuel, turning the forest around the ritual into a burning hellscape. After what seemed to be many hours, the two shadow clones popped, having channeled all their chakra into the blade, and the flames shuddered. A high-pitched wail sounded, and the roaring inferno that now filled the once peaceful clearing began to fall inwards, drawing with it all the dark powers that had been called forth, merging them with the once mortal steel. And it was in this way that darkness fell over the scorched hellscape, earth blackened, nothing standing, and everything for 20 kilometers around burnt into ash. Where the heart of the inferno once raged, a single massive sword stood. The tang easily 70 centimeters long, the blade itself 300 centimeters exactly. A single piece of black metal, for it was no longer mortal steel, but something more. The Yuki and massive amounts of dark side force energy used in its construction had made it something else, something more than any mortal weapon could ever hope to be. Looking upon its tang, Naruto knew it wasn't quite complete, so reaching up to his own torso, he cut himself open. Revealing the bone plating that protected his organs, the young Sith reached within himself and separated a hand's width of his bone from the rest of his body. Focusing his Yuki within himself upon the wound, he watched with dispassionate eyes as his bone rapidly regrew and his flesh knit itself closed. Turning back to the weapon, he levitated the bone to the sword's tang. He pushed his energies into his bone and the handle of the weapon, guiding them together, binding the two into one. Gently, the bone merged with the handle, taking on the shape of the tang, and the blood within the bone flew into the metal, resonating with what had already impregnated the blade. With a flash of light, runes carved themselves into the blade of the sword, two lines trailing from guardless hilt to the broad point of the far edge. The runes dividing the weapon into perfect thirds, and with a second flash the metal into which the runes were carved took on the white color of the bone hilt. Looking over the words carved into the weapon, Naruto felt them resonate with something within him, almost as if the blade was an expression of a fundamental part of himself. Looking upon it, he engraved every detail of the sword upon his mind. The 370 centimeter weapon, the pitch black of the blade, the bone white of the hilt, and runes carved within it. He looked upon the weapon and carved it upon his own soul, impressing the weapon upon himself, even as he reached out to the sword reaching out to him in turn, and bound it within himself. Naruto formed the most intimate tie with the weapon he could, truly making the sword an extension of himself. Once again looking upon the blade, impaled within the ground, longer than he was tall, and he reached up and grabbed the hilt. The sword felt as light as air, and with a flick of his wrist unleashed a wave of blinding white flames into the sky, cracking the air as they flew upwards. Feeling the tendrils of the sword's own power reach outwards, he pushed the force into the sword and felt his eyes widen as the blade drew the life energy and chakra from the very air around him. Everything, down to the smallest bacterium and virus, around him was dead, instantly drained of energy. Focusing, he felt the flow of energy, unfocused and weak, but more than strong enough to devour what was around him, move first through the blade and then into him. In that moment he felt an itch within his mind, turning his attention upon that his sword dispersed into a black mist, and it was with widened eyes that he felt his weapon somehow resting within him. Directing his will once again, the blade formed within his hands, dark energy still radiating from it. Smiling, he directed his chakra, now almost entirely Yuki, through the weapon, and he felt the weapon grow stronger, and with the weapon's growth, so too did his own strength grow. It was slight, insignificant even compared to his normal, physical growth, much less what he gained through his training, but he knew that as his weapon grew, so too did he. And most importantly, as he grew, so too did his weapon. And it was in that moment that he raised the weapon before him and looked upon his own reflection. His body naked, his clothes destroyed by the flames, heavily scarred to the point where a human would be utterly repulsed. Most prominent were the ugly burns and tears from the few times he had been hit by a blaster bolt, and from where the great bear crushed him and his bones split his own skin open, his red skin and black spikes, blazing crimson eyes, and black dreadlocks contrasting and blowing in the slight breeze that disturbed the gaping wound that was once a forest. Naruto knew he looked like a monster, and he was happy to become one, for though he lacked a family, a purpose, he now had a companion. In that moment 2 runes carved themselves into the middle of his sword, and he could not stop the deep, wild, mad laugh that escaped him. He knew his companion's name. Whispering with great reverence, he spoke, "Gentle touch." Several hours later, moving through the burnt hellscape that was once a vibrant forest, Naruto found himself quite alone. However, right on the edge of his senses he could feel at least 2 distinct groups, both with a general sense of wariness around them. Deciding that these people would likely be warriors, and therefore worth testing himself against, he set off in their direction. After a few minutes of running at his top speed, many times faster than an unassisted human could move, he was able to detect more distinct patterns amongst the 2 groups. The first, and slightly larger, of the groups had an air of desperation and hunger. The second, a sense of fear and weariness. Upon reaching the edge of the destruction, the general direction of his prey quickly transitioned into rather sparse forest and an unpaved, if well-trodden, path. Taking to the path, the tree limbs too weak to support his growing weight, he gained more distinct impressions and narrowed down the locations of his quarry. Only 200 meters in, Naruto came to a river, beyond which stood a series of caverns. On the near side of the river about 80 men, bandits by their look, stood in a rough semicircle around a path between 2 rocks, wide enough for about 10 men to pass through. 5 of them, including the largest, wore relatively complete, if simple, armor. Do, Kote, Suniate, and Kabuto. All in all, rather well armored, and going by the well-cared-for katana in their hands, well armed for simple bandits. 10 of the bandits carried crude, but effective bows, though interestingly enough lacked arrows, and were at that moment moving towards the back of the largest group of men. The other 65 bandits wore mostly padded or tatami armor with very, very basic dos. Though they were rather heavily armed, with each man carrying a yari and tanto, most of them clubs, and a few with what could have been wakizashi. Obviously these men were bandits and ronin. Admittedly, they were better organized and equipped than most, but still only bandits. And seeing that the second group consisted of what looked like 7 or so guards, wearing matching, if somewhat simple, leather armor reinforced with small metal plates, and carrying omi yari and tantos, meant that they were most likely a caravan that had been targeted. Reaching out with the force, Naruto felt the group of 60 or so civilians, seemingly a solid mix of young and old, male and female, leading him to suspect these were likely people who had fled the forest fire he had caused. He could also feel pain coming from them, at least some of them were wounded. But most importantly, none of them were even worth the energy it would take to kill. In fact, the strongest fighters here were the 5 ronin, and even they would probably only take a single hit to kill. However, he did need to test his sword, and he hadn't been able to let loose since he had been keeping a low profile while gathering the materials for his sword. With that thought, a grin split his face, rendering his already intimidating face into a terrifying visage, the black pointed teeth only enhancing the dark look. Deciding that he was going to have a bit of fun, he slowly relaxed his tight hold over his own dark aura. To the bandits, it suddenly felt as if it had dropped 10 degrees, the sky had grown darker, and what seemed to be a dark mist began to spill out of the forest behind them. Focusing his power, Naruto called upon his pyrokinesis to create a small line of fire across the bank of the river separating the bandits from their prey. And then he began to walk towards the group. Keiichi was a proud man. He was the firstborn to a minor feudal lord, but his father had been a fool. The old lord had been more concerned with parties and chasing skirts than he had been on managing his lands and vassals. By the time he had become 13, Keiichi had realized that he hated his father, but the last straw had been when his mother had taken her own life in shame for what his father regularly did. He murdered his father and took control of the lands, yet he was too late. His family was so deep in debt that even selling everything he owned wouldn't have covered a tenth of what his father owed. Knowing this, he did the only thing he could do. He swore vassalage to another lord. That was when everything turned even worse. In the dead of the night of his first night of guard duty, as he was obligated to offer 2 months of personal service to his new lord, his master was killed by a shinobi. Humiliated once again, he was given 2 choices, seppuku or he would be stripped of his position. At that point he simply snapped. He killed the retainers that confronted him, likely the men who had hired the assassin in the first place, gathered the men loyal to him, and he left, taking as much as he could. Ironically, the first time he gained recognition from anyone had been when he turned his considerable sword skills on those who were supposed to be his friends. But that was years ago. Now, he and his men had turned bandit, preying on civilians and merchants that moved through the border forests of Hai no Kuni and Kase no Kuni. It had been a good life. He never killed anyone important enough to get ninjas sent after him, and he never sacked any villages, but he had more than enough food. Really, he had everything he ever wanted. Recognition, comrades, territory, hell, he even had a girl he was sweet on. But that damn fire had ended all of that. His fort was burned down, more than 2/3 of his men dead, most of his supplies gone. And now he had been forced to attack a random merchant he had no knowledge of and siege the fat bastard out. And now some asshole ninja was fucking with his men. Letting out a cry of frustration, he began shouting, "Kidomaru, get your fat ass back into line. Junichi, have your squad form ranks, you dumb shit. This is just a fucking ninja screwing with us. It's probably some Chunin level Nukanin that couldn't handle a real fight and ran away. Why do you think he's fucking with us?" With his orders, 2 of his lieutenants moved their squads of men around, ready to confront this ninja. And a deep chuckle began to echo through the forest. Turning to face the direction of the sound, Keiichi readied his sword and his men. "Junichi, take your men forward, root the bastard out and surround him. If he's playing games, the son of a bitch is probably using genjutsu, so don't freak out and pulse your chakra if you have to." Following their leader's orders, 11 men moved forward, more than ready to get rid of the damn ninja stopping from getting their hands on the merchant. Moving in a line, the group approached the tree line, carefully spaced, watching their comrades, and thoroughly searching for their enemy. At that point, a pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared from the darkness of the trees. The chuckle came back, louder than before. And then the eyes began to glow crimson. In that moment, Keiichi felt like something had gone very, very wrong. Then, the slaughter began. The 11 men making up the first row lit up as flames consumed their bodies from within. In a matter of seconds, the scent of burning flesh, the sound of bones cracking from the heat, and an otherwise terrible silence fell over the clearing. Not a single one of the victims had time to cry out as they were consumed by the terrible flames. As the bodies fell, they turned to ash, being carried off by a fall breeze. In that moment, Keiichi heard nothing but his own heartbeat, saw nothing but those eyes looking at him over the burning bodies of his men, and smelled a sick mixture of pine needles and cooked meat. A scream split the silence. A lone man from the second squad, one of Junichi's men, charged at the eyes, constantly screaming for the ninja to die. He exploded. The bandit's body seemingly ripped itself apart, the viscera being violently launched backwards. Keiichi spiked his chakra. Nothing changed. The smear of one of his men, The burn marks from the deaths of an entire squad of his men, and that damned smell still remained. Only now the tang of blood entered the air. It's just a fucking genjutsu, gut the bastard you sons of bitches. With his cry, Keiichi watched his men crumble. Thinking the fighters under him might rally had been a mistake that cost exactly 20 men, 2 squads, their lives as they tried to flee. At the very second their bodies reached the riverbank, walls of white flames leapt into the sky. The displaced air forced the ashes of the now disintegrated bodies back into the clearing. Keiichi spiked his chakra. Nothing changed. The walls of white flames reached up into the sky, 3 times taller than any of his men. The smell of blood and piss filled the clearing. A slight undercurrent of cooked meat along with a twisted feeling of hunger lanced through him. His throat was too dry to speak, but he could still taste the ashes of his dead men on his tongue, and he could hear that damn chuckling. It's just an illusion. It has to be. Charge. Attack. Do something. Keiichi issued his command, but it only escaped as the barest murmur. In that moment Keiichi could only watch as the monster that had so easily butchered his men stalked forward. A surge of black mist heralded its coming. The feeling of terror, of being truly insignificant, of being a toy intensified. And then the thing stepped out of the shadows. Easily 3 meters tall, broader than 2 men, with large and very visible muscled. Of course, the first thing he noticed was the red skin, then the fact that this thing had what looked like black bone spikes coming out of his arms. When it grinned, Keiichi knew that whatever the hell this monster was, it was most certainly not human. It had black fucking teeth and the goddamned teeth looked as long as his fingers. Pulsing his chakra widely, Keiichi didn't even notice when the monster pulled a sword bigger than itself out of thin air. He didn't notice when a wall of white flames consumed the rest of his men. Babbling incoherently, Keiichi dropped onto his backside, muttering, "It's a genjutsu," over and over and over again. Spiking his chakra did nothing to change this hellscape he was in. The disintegrated corpses of his men drifting on a breeze created by the flames, the constant smell of charred flesh, and that goddamn chuckle. Noticing a shadow cover him, Keiichi looked up, and the last thing he saw was the sharp end of a very, very large blade. Looking down at the now dead bandit leader, Naruto felt a strong sense of disappointment. He had only used his new sword's powers once. Though wielding the blade did seem to enhance any force-conjured flames he used, interestingly enough. Drawing his blade from the ground with a wet thunk, Naruto willed the flames to disperse. Confirming that none of his targets escaped, the young Sith let a small smile grace his features. He always enjoyed a job well done. Deciding to see to the civilians, he turned his attention to the men who had been fighting the bandits. And immediately had to stifle a laugh. The 7 men all wore expressions that somehow communicated fear, awe, disgust, and a great deal of surprise. Idly reading their surface thoughts, the men were so distracted Naruto imagined he could dance through their minds and they would not notice. It seemed the fear and awe were directed at him, the disgust at the lingering scent of burning flesh, and the surprise at the fact that they were still alive at the moment. Interpreting Naruto's starring as a potential threat, the leader of the guards dropped into a seiza and was quickly followed by his men. "We thank you mighty Oni, for saving us. If it would please you, we have sake we might have offer in gratitude." All in all, Naruto was rather impressed by how little the man had stuttered. What with the fact that Naruto had just butchered 80 or so men die in various horrible ways. Deciding that he would take them up on their offer, he voiced his one addition. "And a pair of pants. My lord? I require a pair of pants as well. My lord, I'm not sure we have any in your size." "No matter, we will settle this later." With his piece said, Naruto strode over to the now standing, if rather nervous, guards. Stretching out his senses, he swept the area, looking for any possible threats, either from another bandit group or a possible attack from the merchants. While he felt no threat, he did feel several guards. Deciding to address this issue, he spoke up, "You have wounded. Take me to them and I will heal them." The guards shared a nervous look, but it seemed their desire to see their comrades whole and healthy won out. "Of course sir, right this way." As the head of the guards led Naruto, with an escort of 4 rather nervous spearmen, to the wounded, he engaged the young Sith in an attempt at conversation. "My lord, I hope you don't mind me asking, but, why did you save us?" I did not in fact save you, my intention was to engage the bandits. Your survival was a consequence to my actions, not their motivator. However, that does mean I intend to inflict further injury upon you. Well my lord, I can't say I'm exactly happy about your motivations, but I'm sure as hell not going to complain about your results. After a short walk, the group came upon 8 wounded men, arranged so the least wounded were closest to the entrance. The 3 closest had knives and spears close by them, evidence that these men likely intended to fight should the bandits make it as far as the wounded. All 8 of the men bore evidence of attempted medical assistance, but no civilians were nearby, and while not immediately an issue, it did pique Naruto's interest enough for him to question it. Guardsmen, where are your medics? Well my lord, they were all civilians, and seeing as you are rather, no offense intended my lord, but you're rather scary looking. We wanted to avoid causing a scene or offending you. Nodding, Naruto responded, thank you guardsmen. I will work better without interference. Direct me to the most wounded of your men first. At his directions the leader took him to a heavily bandaged man. Kneeling down, Naruto began his examination. 3 wounds that looked to be from a spear, likely sustained during the initial bandit attack. Serious contusions along his palms, already turning a rather nasty purple, what looked to be a concussion, and a few assorted scrapes and cuts. I see 3 serious stab wounds, serious bruising along his hands, and a concussion. Step back, I will need space for what I am about to do. At his words the guards stepped back, making sure the injured were cleared as well. Kneeling, Naruto reached within himself, finding the very core of his force abilities, and opened a path for it. As the power flew through him, red sparks began to form in the air around him. After a few seconds of focusing, his eyes snapped open, and with them he perceived. Looking about the small cave he was in, his eyes perceived every flaw in the stonework, every flaw in every piece of weaponry or armor, and on each man, wounded or not, webs of lines danced across their skin. But he did not see these things. No, his eyes were vacant, glassy. But with great care, he reached out a single claw and began to trace a few of the lines on the wounded man. As he traced those lines he channeled the force into each of the flaws. And as the force danced within the injuries, the flesh healed itself. Broken bones set themselves, organs reformed, muscles bound themselves into a hole, and skin knit itself together again. Perhaps 15 seconds after he began the healing, the first man was hale and hearty once again. Opening his mouth, he uttered only one word, next, and complying with the warrior-turned-healer, each of the wounded were brought before him in turn. After a half-hour of healing every single injury, old and new, solving every issue with each man, and honoring his word, Naruto found himself without a patient. Shutting his eyes, he turned inwards once again, stopping up the flow of power. Without shifting, Naruto let a small smirk cross his lips. Guardsmen, I think I'll have that sake now. 5 days later, sipping from the rather large bottle of sake that Eiji, the head of the caravan and apparently a rather successful silk merchant, had given him, Naruto pondered the most recent events in his rather short, if intense, life. First, Masahiro, the captain of the guards, had promptly asked him if he was, in fact, a kami which had taken mortal form. After getting over his surprise, Naruto promptly disabused Masahiro of his mistaken, if somewhat understandable, beliefs. Apparently, none of the guards believed him. Within an hour, each and every member of the caravan had come to thank him personally, each offering small gifts of food, rice wine, or small trinkets. Completely surprised by their actions and with absolutely no idea how to react, he simply thanked each person and healed any small injuries they had. Thankfully, he had no need to enter a trance once again, but this had seemingly solidified his position as a protective spirit in the eyes of the peasants. While he was somewhat loath to admit it, he had been rather touched at how much the people seemed to think about him. To show that he appreciated their gifts, Naruto had tied several of the small trinkets into his hair. And while he would never admit such a thing, his favorite gift had come from Suzume, the 14-year-old daughter of Eiji. It seemed that her older brother had been the first man Naruto had healed and she gifted him a pair of engraved silver bells that had been her mother's. After inspecting them, Naruto had found a small ceiling array that allowed the bells to cast a weak auditory genjutsu, causing disorientation and a sense of vertigo when chakra was channeled into them. He had bashfully, or as bashfully as a seemingly emotionless 3-meter-tall Sith warrior can be, tied them into a small forelock of hair that now hung down the right side of his face. Though it had been later in the evening on the fourth night, when the group had settled down for the evening, that the most impressive gift had been given to him. As the caravan had lacked a pair of pants in his size, he had been given a large tarp to wear around his waist. It seemed the women of the group decided he could use an actual piece of clothing. They had sewn together a yukata from several blankets they had taken apart. While it was simple, blue with an obi that was literally a length of rope, Naruto had been touched. The only other clothing he had ever owned had been what the Hokage had forced the stores in Konoha to sell to him or what his master had authorized him to wear on a mission. Though, he had, possibly, gone a bit too far. That morning, as thanks, he had gone through and activated the chakra coils of each and every member of the group. Though it took a bit more than 2 hours, the entirety of the group were now able to mold their chakra, even if none of them had shinobi training. After a short amount of internal deliberation, he had decided that since he activated their chakra, he had a responsibility to help them learn to use it. Of course, the adults would likely never have very large reserves, 2 to 3 times that of a fresh civilian at the absolute most. Those that were children and even teenagers would be able to build up reserves of their own. When the guards refused to refer to him as anything other than Kami-sama, or my lord, afterwards, he had finally told the group his real name. Under normal circumstances, Naruto would have never revealed his name to anyone. But for the first time since his exposure to the Force Echo, he had been given a feeling. He had been urged to answer honestly when a young child had come up to him, no older than 6, and asked him, rather softly, what his name was. Deciding this was significant enough to justify breaking his normal protocols, he spoke his name to them, Uzumaki Naruto. Interestingly enough, this convinced the old women who still remembered the Uzumaki clan to take the yukata back and incorporate a large, white Uzumaki swirl on the back. Ultimately, the strangest thing that had happened was the fact that a few of the women in the group, mostly those whom he was teaching, seemed to have developed something of an infatuation with him. In a rather strange turn, his eyes and facial tendrils had become exotic, rather than terrifying or hideous, and the fact that he carried such heavy scars simply proved that he was a great and mighty warrior. It was a rather strange situation for the young Sith to be in. He was likely the greatest killer alive on this planet. Naruto had no doubt that he would likely be an S rank by ninja standards, and the fact that he was still growing meant he was rather far from his peak, and he was hesitant to spend time around females only slightly older than himself. However, he was not afraid, he just somewhat uneasy. Naruto blamed it on the fact he had likely begun the first stages of puberty. Though that thought brought a grimace to his face, Sith undergo a rather rapid puberty within 3.5 years or so. What made it unpleasant was that their natural aggressiveness and more violent tendencies were greatly enhanced by the hormones. Ultimately, he decided to chalk the situation up to the fact that they still thought he was a god and simply ignore it. 2 weeks later, Naruto was content. Over the last 3 weeks he had found and promptly butchered 6 groups of bandits, taught his students basic chakra control exercises, and had grown a bit overfond of rice wine. Thankfully, his Sith biology and Yuki prevented him from actually growing drunk. As it was highly likely that with those advantages he would have both drank all the alcohol in the caravan, he was rather thankful to the bandits as they tended to hoard the stuff, and reduced his liver into a blackened mess in the process. Amusingly, it seemed Eiji was something of a connoisseur himself, and after finding out about his protector's love of the drink, and immunity to its side effects, had taken it upon himself to teach Naruto how to identify the different types of sake by smell, sight, and the smallest of sips. The culture surrounding the drinks, especially Nihonshu, was actually a rather pleasant thing to learn about. Honestly, he was enjoying helping these people. It was also rather effective training for when he would need to lead men of his own. Early on, the leaders of the group, Eiji, Masahiro, and a village elder named Satoru, had been hesitant to ask him for aid. After he realized that the group was running a bit low on food and he approached the group to offer his aid, it was decided to include him in their councils. His response, as it was to most things, was to simply find a group of outlaws and take their food. While it may have been a bit much once he started sending out shadow clones to ensure the way forward was clear of debris and to find any possible bandits, and the gods know how useful they were for resupplies, Naruto felt he was only doing his part. The villagers still insisted on treating him like a kami, so he would act like one. Of course, it all had to end sooner or later. Right now, they were less than 2 days' travel from the fire capital and on roads with regular patrols. Even now it was somewhat dangerous for him to be out without a hanjon, something he was loath to do. Objectively, the young Sith knew that transforming was safer for everyone, but he was proud, and he had hidden for the first 6 years of his life while living in the shadows for the last 4. It was good being able to simply be, even if it was only for a short time. Of course, not everything was perfect. It seemed that Suzume herself had something of a crush on him. He had done nothing to encourage her and treated her like the rest of his students, but she seemingly did not get the message. However, he was hesitant to be firmer as she had done nothing inappropriate and he frankly had no idea whatsoever on how to deal with a teenage girl. His studies into psychology were mostly related to direct applications in combat, and torturing the girl was a bit extreme for the situation. It was at that moment that his best student had begun walking up the sheer cliff face he was currently standing on while thinking about that very girl. She was roughly 154 centimeters tall, with shoulder-length black hair, and with warm, gray eyes that held a hint of the warrior she could be. Dressed in an unrestricting calf-length skirt and a well-made western shirt, both of a dark green color, her feet were clad in sandals that wrapped up and across the ankles, while a brown coat laid open over her medium-sized chest. Altogether, she cut a rather pleasant figure, even to the Sith warrior, with the noticeably sharp features of a noble she had inherited from her mother, according to Eiji at least. Suzume, not that I am displeased that you found me so quickly, but it is just after midnight. You do have a long day ahead of you tomorrow. Sighing that she had once again failed to so much as make her sensei guess at who she was, Suzume replied, Sensei, I've asked you a half-dozen times and I'm pretty sure the others have asked just as many times, but how do you always know who approaches you? Idly contemplating on whether or not he should give a half-answer, she did respond to his question with another. Ultimately, Naruto figured he should be honest. He was going to be gone soon, many different ways. The simplest is your scent. You have a faint hint of sake and mulberry trees. I can also feel your presence through 2 separate means, one nearly unique to me, the other, your chakra. And when you are not careful, I can hear you. Eyes wide, Suzume responded, Sensei, you never give a straight answer to that question. What's wrong? At her response, Naruto failed to stifle a small chuckle. Have I really become so predictable? Perhaps it is good then, that I am to leave within the next 2 days. What? But you belong with us. We need you, Sensei, I need you. At first Suzume was so surprised she couldn't help but shout, but by the end she was mumbling. Of course, Naruto was a super soldier who had already enhanced senses elevated to a level superior to that of most animals. Suzume. His tone firm, Naruto's student's head snapped up, looking at her teacher and savior with watery eyes. Suzume. I know you have a crush, let me finish. In a gentle tone the Sith called out to his student before stopping her interruption, it is a crush. An infatuation. I suddenly appeared, killed men who intended you harm, saved your brother, unlocked your people's chakra, and taught you everything you know of the shinobi arts. You are a young, if rather talented, girl. I have done many things that would direct positive emotions towards me. As of this moment, you believe me perfect, and so you have developed an infatuation with me. With a few tears in her eyes, the young girl thought over her teacher's words. Sighing, she concluded he was right, but that didn't mean she had to like he was leaving. Sensei, even if you're right that I only have a crush on you, I still want to know why you're leaving. You know that you're more than welcome to stay with either the villagers or my father's merchant caravan. To be honest, Dad's probably going to hire the whole village and take them to one of the mulberry farms. I know that, and I am not happy that I must leave. I have grown fond of our little group. To be honest, I have never had people to call my own. But I must return to my master. Having explained his reasons in as much detail as he could, he doubted even Suzume would think him sane if he tried to explain the force and the fact that he was mostly alien. He turned away, simply looking down on the resting group. It was at that moment his head snapped up. Suzume, I have detected approximately 50 chakra signatures of varying levels approaching us from the north by northwest. They are moving at speed and in an attack pattern. Return to the camp and alert the guards, I will head them off. Do not attempt to back me up. Move the group up onto one of the nearby hills, other than that, normal defensive position. Hi. Responding immediately, the young girl took off at an impressive speed for one with only 2 weeks of training. Though the unquestioning and instant response was more from the fact that all 3 of the times that there had been trouble, Naruto had immediately stepped up and took command of the all knew he was the best leader among their group and none questioned his prowess in battle. Now, the Sith warrior launched himself from the cliff face, a burst of chakra ensuring he was well clear of the trees below. Once he had taken to the air, he channeled the force around him, pushing himself forward. As he flew to intercept the approaching shinobi, he cloaked himself in the force, preventing any of his chakra from escaping from his body. Relying on his senses to detect his target, he angled himself downwards. Falling from the sky, he grabbed the shinobi furthest from the center, snapping the man up as he plummeted from the trees. Holding the now terrified man in his claws, the Sith looked into the man's eyes and pushed. Completely lacking in finesse or technique, Naruto reduced the Nukenin to a vegetable as he ravaged the man's mind and ripped the desired information from his victim. Launching himself into the sky, Naruto aimed for a clearing around a minute ahead of the incoming shinobi. And with a snarl he let himself fall. After 10 or so seconds, he touched down. Turning, he faced the oncoming shinobi and waited until they were just about on top of him. As they were seconds from passing him, the warrior flared his chakra, as high and bright as he could. In that moment the world shivered as it felt the Kyuubi no Yoko's air announce its presence. A chakra even greater and more malevolent than the feared demon fox's Yuki filled the air, freezing the shinobi with its presence. In that moment, each and every man heard the terrible command that they could not yet truly understand, "Come." As the hostile shinobi closed in on him, Naruto stood proudly, his face showing nothing but a bit of mild disappointment that his enemies were so clearly lacking in subtlety. Once the group had surrounded him, Naruto spoke, "Kurasuki Raiga, Suin of Takigakure, and Rokusho Aoi, come out. You cannot hide from me." At his words 3 men leapt from the trees. The first was a rather tall man, still shorter than Naruto, with shoulder-length green hair and clothed in a large black cloak. The second was an older brown-haired man wearing a tan bandana over his hair and black clothing. The third man was also green-haired, wearing an Omegakure Hite 8 and a white outfit. Stepping forward, Aoi began to speak, "Damn, you are one ugly motherfucker. I mean, I was expecting you to be pretty damn hideous, but actually have face tentacles. Rokusho, shut up, you felt his chakra, this is serious. Screw you Suin, he was probably just pulsing his chakra super high. I mean, I felt Jinchuriki before and he can't have more than them. Did you consider that he may be a Jinchuriki himself?" At that moment several black projectiles impaled themselves into the ground a few centimeters away from the bickering shinobi. Naruto spoke up, "Enough talking, I'm rather bored, so I'm gonna kill you now." Launching himself forwards, Naruto couldn't stop the manic grin from clawing its way onto his face. As he approached the 3 Nukenin he felt multiple hostiles approach from behind him and from the side. Dropping all of his weight onto his right leg, he spun in place while his momentum had him continue to tear up the ground as he slid forward. Once the shinobi had entered into his reach, Naruto lashed out with his claws, disemboweling the first hostile faster than the rest could see. Once again shifting his considerable weight, Naruto dropped further to his right, grabbing a second enemy by the leg as he moved past him. Tossing the man up by the leg, the Sith grabbed his victim's second leg and promptly kicked the man in the crotch. So much force was exerted that the man's pelvis collapsed, his intestines ruptured, and his heart stopped from the shock. Using the corpse as a blunt instrument, the rather entertained Sith slammed the other 3 shinobi that had attempted to intercept him back into the tree line, killing 2 of them. Sliding to a stop, Naruto let a deep, barking laugh escape his lips. It seemed his little display worked better than he had hoped. Each and every shinobi there was now focused on him to the exclusion of all else. Deciding to play with his enemies, and give them an opportunity to regroup and make this a bit more interesting for him, Naruto spoke up, "So, how much is the price on my head? I mean, obviously, it's pretty damn big to get this many shinobi after me." Kurasuki, stepping forward, replied, "Right now, 2,500 ryo." Whistling appreciatively, Naruto continued the little talk, "I hope you guys are being paid in gold. I mean, even if they pay you in brass, that's still 2.5 million coins. So, I'm pretty sure we've already lost. Turning his head, Kurasuke grimaced. When you're done playing with these assholes, I've got a proposition for you. Intrigued, Naruto nodded his head. At that moment, with a call of fire, 45 jutsu, 20 of lightning, the rest of water, were launched at him. A dancing wall of lightning-enhanced water rushed at him, fully intending on electrocuting or crushing him to death. Returning to the battle, Naruto let his face slip back into a grin, and slowed his breathing. 7 seconds until the technique hit him. In. 6 seconds. Out. 5 seconds. In. 4 seconds. Out. 3 seconds. In. 2 seconds. Out. With a roar from the Sith, a ball of fire many times larger than he was erupted from his maw. As the technique collided inches from his face, Naruto watched the grass catch fire, just to disintegrate. He watched the particles of water evaporate around the fireball, even as the lightning merged with the flame technique. The only reason his clothes survived was thanks to the fact that he had manifested a weak chakra cloak, offering the fabric protection from the raging inferno mere meters from them. After 20 seconds of battling, a full 20 shinobi collapsed from chakra exhaustion. The rest did their best to escape the oncoming destruction. Of the 45 ninja that had attacked, 18 escaped the jutsu. Those that survived held nothing but rage on their faces, Naruto's dark side aura pushing their baser emotions to the fore, clouding his enemy's focus. As the remaining warriors charged, Naruto waited. 30 seconds later, a massive eruption lit up the sky. About a kilometer up and away from the fight, the fireball had lost cohesion and finally detonated. Exploiting the momentary distraction, the Sith warrior darted forward, closing with his nearest enemy. Forcing his way into his opponent's guard with a shoulder check, Naruto followed through with a powerful left spearhand, fully impaling his enemy through the shinobi's chest. Seeing their target closing with them, the remaining shinobi drew weapons of all kinds. Some wielded katana, others kunai, some kusarigama, and one even held a kanabo. What drew Naruto's attention, however, was what could only be a lightsaber. Seeing his opponent's look, Rokusho smirked, and then taunted, "See this, you son of a bitch? This is the legendary Raijin no Ken, the sword of the Naidame Hokage. And I'm gonna use it to cut you the fuck up." Naruto sighed. He would investigate the sword later. Right now, he had victims to butcher. Focusing chakra into his limbs, he readied himself to end this fight. The second his enemies began to charge, Naruto launched himself against them once more. His first target was the kanabo-wielding idiot. The man was a bit larger than the rest, but much slower. He didn't seem to be strong enough to properly use his intimidating, for a normal person, weapon. Naruto punished his folly by driving his heel spike through the man's skull and promptly used his most recent kill to propel himself forward. Hitting his next target foot first, he found himself standing on top of a man with a now crushed rib cage. Twisting at the waist, the Sith narrowly dodged a twin sword strike from some idiot trying to dual-wield two dato. By the gods, did Naruto hate assholes like that. As he broke the man's right arm and then impaled him on the weapon he dropped, Naruto began to openly rant as he continued his slaughter. You know, if you're going to use an overlong sword, at least use one you're familiar with. Here he paused to rip a pinned man's throat out with his teeth. And if you're gonna wield two weapons, regardless of what they are, fucking train with them first. Again pausing to disembowel his latest target, he spun on his foot and moved to the edge of the group of shinobi. Pulsing his chakra, he then pulled his force energy to the fore and dashed forward. Ending the technique, he looked down at the man he had impaled with both his hands. You know, it doesn't matter how cool your sword is, if you never learn how to use the damn thing. Tossing the strange shinobi's corpse to the side, he picked up the Raijin no Ken. Running a bit of force energy through the sword, Naruto felt something. Though it was very, very strange. Honestly, whoever had converted the weapon had done a pretty crap job. It was like it ran half off force energy, half off chakra. Add to that, the base requirements were pretty intense. No wonder the asshole who had been swinging the thing around was so crap with it. Altogether, it would have killed the man to use it at full power for more than a minute. Pulling his chakra back into himself and then directing it into the sword, Naruto could only smile as a white-blue blade jumped from the hilt of the weapon. Turning to the remaining hostiles, who were at that moment charging towards him in a frenzy, eyes bleeding and mouths foaming, Naruto unleashed a wave of lightning-natured chakra from the sword. As the energy impacted his enemies, Naruto watched as the energy cooked the men alive. Their eyes burst, their skin burned, and to a man, their hair and clothes caught on fire. He turned away. It was time to speak with Kurisuke. So, you had a proposition? Kurisuke Raiga was a veteran warrior, former Anbu, a missing nin, and a madman. And the blood-drenched abomination standing before him, twirling a legendary weapon like it was a stick, terrified him. However, he did not wish to speak with this being for his own sake, but for Rinmara's. The one good thing in his life was under threat. Under threat from Raiga himself. He felt his control slipping just a bit more every day that passed. Sooner or later, there was no telling what he would do. And this being was looking after a group of civilians, at seemingly no cost to them. Surely, he would look after one more child, especially one so valuable. Swallowing, Kurisuke spoke. Yeah. I was hoping you would look after my partner. He's nearly crippled, but he possesses a dujutsu, a powerful one, that works like a combination of the Byakugan and the Sharingan. And what do you offer? I was going to offer to duel you one-on-one. Let you take the Kiba swords like you don't need a sword, much less mine now. Grimacing, Kurisuke considered what else he might offer. Realistically, the only other things he knew were a few B-rank water and lightning techniques, a handful of A-rank abilities, and the art of silent killing. He could probably offer to write down the techniques and the basics of the art, but that wouldn't be much to the monster in front of him. Why would I have wanted your swords? You don't know who I am. Should I? Sighing, Kurisuke felt a twitch form in his brow, but he needed to stay calm. I am Kurisuke Raiga, former member of the Kiri no Shinobigatana Shichinen Shu. I'm also ex-Anbu and was a Junin back in Kiri. 4 I went Nukanen anyways. So, you were a Junin, that means you could teach? Sighing, Raiga knew this was the worst thing the man could ask. Look, I can't do that. Seeing the man, he was reasonably sure the being was male. Raise an eyebrow, he continued. It's got to do with why I can't look after the kid myself. Seems like, after killing a lot of people, something kinda broke up there. While the vague gestures to his head probably got his point across, Raiga knew he wasn't being particularly clear with what he was trying to say. Look, I've been killing for a long time. For the most part, it didn't bother me. Hell, I enjoyed it, maybe not as much as you did. Anyways, after I found the kid, well, I got a conscience. And it's telling me to try to keep the kid safe. At this point, he took Rinmara off his back and opened the gray bag the boy was carried in. Rinmara, let him know what you can do. I'm not very strong, but my eyes allow me to see through any barriers, wood, stone, whatever. Also, I can see chakra signatures, and I can interfere with other dojutsu. There was a man with an implanted Byakugan back in Kiri, so I know I can do something. I just don't know how powerful the technique is. But I'm not really sure what the limit of my dojutsu is. With his explanation done, Kurisuke knelt down next to Rinmara and put his hand on the boy's shoulder, a small smile on the older man's lips. For Rinmara, this was enough to help the boy overcome some of the nervousness he was feeling, and he gave a shy smile in response. Naruto, however, had something of an idea of the two's relationship, and decided to kill several birds with one stone. So, you're willing to give Rinmara to a random stranger, with whom you have only seen kill many men. Additionally, you have not attempted to contact anyone else about this? At this the Nukanen gave a sheepish grin and scratched the back of his head. Well, I'm kinda desperate, and you've got a bunch of civilians with you. So, you know. Once again raising an eyebrow, Naruto responded, yes, I do know. Any village would likely use him as breeding stock to create a force of dojutsu users. Especially since it can counter the Byakugan, one of the strongest dojutsus remaining. At worst, they'd dissect him and try to create artificial users. At this Rinmara grew rather pale, with Kurisuke responding, so you get why I came to someone like you and not somewhere like Konoha or Kumo. Nodding, Naruto thought over his next words carefully. If this worked out, he could gain a great deal at little to no cost. I may be able to heal your mind, and heal Rinmara's body, but it is going to cost you. Also, if it goes badly, you will end up brain dead, at best. As he said that, the other's eyes shot open. What they were being offered was more than they could have ever hoped for, so both immediately became suspicious. So, what do you want? And even if I do agree with it, I want your word that you'll take care of Rinmara if something goes wrong. Again nodding, Naruto spoke, I guarantee you that I will see the boy taken care of. And I want your knowledge, your skills, and your aid. I cannot remain with my people forever. I want you to train them as best you can and protect them when I cannot. It would also be remiss of me to not tell you that both techniques will be highly unpleasant. With thoughtful looks on their faces, the two began to discuss what they intended to do. Turning away from them, the young Sith gave the pair a bit of privacy. That he could hear every word that they said, well, that went unsaid. Turning back to the Sith, Raiga nodded. Very well. Kurisuke Raiga, look into my eyes, do not resist me, and open your mind. Grabbing the shinobi's face, Naruto formed a mental lance and struck out with it. As the man did have rather significant reserves of chakra, the young Sith had been required to put a great deal of force into his probe. That Kurisuke did not cry out when the mental probe struck proved the discipline of the man in question, and in moments Naruto was within the man's mind. As Naruto had roughly forced his way through the barriers protecting Kurisuke, he had no way to control what he saw. So it was with a sense of disgust he watched the life of Kurisuke Raiga play out. The man had never had a childhood. His father had been an alcoholic former shinobi. Not good enough to serve for his entire life, but talented enough to avoid repercussions for his beating of Raiga and Raiga's mother. As the years scrolled by, Naruto watched as Kurisuke's mother committed suicide and the young boy killed his drunk father in retaliation. Brutal academy years flew past, with only a moment's hesitation when a young Kurisuke killed several other boys during graduation. The rest of the memories were a blur with only a few things standing out. However, Naruto had seen enough to know what he needed to fix. And so he got to work. While it was most certainly not perfect, his efforts were passable. The worst of the memories were blunted, just enough to take the edge off. Kurisuke's more violent impulses would be dulled, though great care was taken to leave what killer instinct the man might have intact. A few things, like his mother's suicide, were simply buried deeply enough to not affect the man directly. Altogether, someone who had even a moderate amount of skill at manipulating another's mind would deride Naruto's effort as amateurish at best. Considering this was the first time Naruto had actually done something more than sending out particularly strong emotions or ripping information from a mind, the chakra barrier, and Naruto's utter lack of skill in the mind arts, it was rather good. Withdrawing from Kurisuke's mind, the first thing the Sith noticed was that the aforementioned shinobi was bleeding rather heavily from his nose. Rather than panicking, Naruto drew on the dark side, his yellow eyes turning red, and focused the force energy on his potential ally. After a few moments, the bleeding stopped and Kurisuke was not only fully healed, but was the healthiest he had ever been in his life. After setting the man down on the ground, Naruto turned to the young boy, still channeling the force, and motioned for the child to approach him. Reaching out and touching the young boy's head, Naruto relaxed somewhat. The boy's deficiencies seemed genetic, but the physical side effects would be easily fixed. Where Naruto's experience with sentient minds was almost completely focused on overpowering or burning them out, his knowledge of the anatomy of more than 200 species was quite extensive. Admittedly, it was focused on the most efficient, painful, or amusing way to take them apart, but it was still just as effective when it came time to put them back together. With that in mind, the boy's issues, mostly an issue with the protein chains that made up his muscles, were solved and the more delicate task of fixing the child's genetic structure could begin. After about half an hour of standing there with his hand on the child's head and his mind looking at the boy's genetic structure, not entirely dissimilar from his own pre-changed genes though not quite as efficient, he decided on his course of action. A single, massive burst of dark-side energy focused on purification, followed by flooding the boy's body with dark-side energy under the control of his dark transference. It was the energies that were released, once Naruto began, that awoke Kurisuke. And to his slight trepidation he saw Rinmara's face paled to the point he looked more like a corpse, while the child's veins grew and turned black. Thankfully, for Kurisuke, the moments passed quickly and Rinmara fell unconscious the second Naruto withdrew his hand. Turning to look at the now awake Nin, Naruto simply stated, "It is done," and picked both of them up. Knowing that Rinmara was safe, Kurisuke allowed exhaustion to take him and slipped back into the most peaceful sleep he'd had in years. Naruto carried the now normal Rinmara and Kurisuke with him as he leapt towards where the villagers were camped. With the Force, it was but a matter of moments before the Sith arrived at his objective. Nodding at the guards, who spiked their chakra at his appearance, as he had taught them, he handed his two newest traveling companions over as soon as his men had confirmed he was not an illusion. With only a few instructions to keep a full watch for the full night and assurances that there were no nearby shinobi, Naruto leapt into the boughs of a large tree and for the first time in roughly a month went to sleep. 24 hours later, as Naruto leapt through the forest that made up most of Hai no Kuni, he thought back to what had happened. The villagers had welcomed both Kurisuke and Rinmara. As they explained it upon his questioning, they trusted him. And if he said these two were to teach and protect them, they would do all they could to make the Nukanon's job as easy as possible. Admittedly, the side effects of Naruto's healing of Kurisuke's mind may have helped with that. Instead of a cold and violent shinobi, he had become a quiet and rather thoughtful man. When asked about it, he had admitted that his emotions were blunted and that his impulsive nature had been almost entirely removed. It seemed that the man had been rather pleased with the outcome, all things considered. Rinmara himself was just happy that the man who gave him the world would be able to stick around and that he could make a few new friends. However, the rest of the group was a bit more upset by his leaving. For the most part, the villagers understood that most people would not take his appearance well. The only exceptions were the young children, who would much rather their new protector remain with them. It was particularly disconcerting for Naruto, considering his life up unto that point. Seeing how his village abused him and the majority of the rest of his life was spent in an underground bunker, that was rather understandable. Ultimately, his assurances they would be safe were accepted and he was able to part from them. Their parents, on the other hand, were understanding of how things would likely work. And the most certainly did not want their protector to suffer at the hands of the daimyo or his men. It was a rather somber meeting between Eiji, his son Ichiro, one of the guards Naruto had healed, and Suzume. Eiji was sad his drinking partner would be gone and Ichiro was disappointed Naruto would no longer be able to teach him. Suzume, now that she had gotten her crush under control, which Naruto fully blamed on the dark side aura he constantly put out, was rather sad, but ultimately would continue to train to one day be strong enough to defend her family. And the only reason that Naruto had shown them the Kage Bunshin was to make sure they got the most out of the training they possibly could. When he was ready to leave, after leaving behind several scrolls containing everything he knew of the shinobi arts, the villagers saw him off with cheer and a wave, particularly large from the guards, and it was with a sigh he turned and left. Now, he was only a few hours away from his base, cradling a small sample of Rinmara's blood held in a canteen, and he was more than ready to report in and get a shower.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.